we journey into the mystical realm of Amalur to explore the complete story of Kingdoms of Amalur, Reckoning and its expansion, Fatesworn. Over the next couple of hours, we'll uncover the ancient histories, forgotten ages, and the epic tale of the Fateless One, who defied destiny itself. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this epic adventure together. The dawn of Amalur, from darkness to light, to understand the events of Kingdoms of Amalur. Reckoning, we must first journey back through the mists of time to the very beginning of this mystical world. The story of Amalur spans 10,000 years of carefully crafted history by renowned fantasy author R.A. Salvatore, a tapestry of civilizations rising and falling, gods walking among mortals, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. In the beginning, there was the Deep Gloam, a primordial age of darkness that shrouded the world in shadow. This ancient period remains largely mysterious, with only haunting stories and fragmented legends surviving to tell of what transpired during this time. It is said that darkness engulfed all of Amalur, and the few mortals who survived did so by hiding away from the malevolent forces that roamed the surface world. No records have ever been found that detail what happened during the Deep Gloam, leading some religious zealots to believe this was when the gods created Amalur itself. Tales whisper that this Deep Gloam might one day return to punish the wicked, stories sometimes used by parents to frighten their children into obedience. But what caused the Deep Gloam to finally subside remains one of Amalur's greatest mysteries. Analytical minds continue to search for factual evidence of what occurred during this era, though the darkness has kept its secrets well hidden. Following the Deep Gloam came the Age of Enlightenment, named for the emergence of civilization as light finally returned to the world. This ancient age was dominated by the Empire of Erathi, a kingdom said to be ruled by the mysterious Erathi, a race of powerful magical beings dedicated to the god Mitharu, Lord of Order. The Erathi possessed incredible magical abilities and were devoted to bringing structure and divine order to the chaos that had reigned during the Dark Gloam. Yet for all their power, the Erathi faded from history as quickly as they had appeared, causing some scholars to question whether they ever truly existed at all. Only abandoned ruins that extend far below the world's surface remain as testament to their presence, along with fragments of a tome called the Codex of Order. These underground chambers speak of a civilization of immense sophistication and magical prowess, yet their sudden disappearance remains as mysterious as their origins. The ruins left behind by the Erathi would prove crucial in later ages, particularly their creation of doors and locks that could only be opened by someone not bound by fate. This detail would become significant thousands of years later, suggesting that perhaps the Erathi possessed knowledge of events yet to come, or perhaps understanding of the very nature of destiny itself. As the ages turned, the world of Amalur saw the rise and fall of many great civilizations. During the Middle Kingdoms, a clan of hill giants called the Mairu underwent a cultural transformation based around devotion to the goddess Athene. Gaining leadership of the Uranos in the land of Gentilak, the Mairu reinvented themselves as the Colossi, claiming to be heirs to the legacy of the ancient Titans. To demonstrate their prowess as lords of the Uranos, these giants ordered the construction of a magnificent capital city called Athenius, built high atop the soaring peaks of Gentilak, as close to the gods as possible. However, the Uranos was a notoriously unstable alliance, held together more by force than diplomacy. The Etins, still bitter over losing leadership of the Uranos, refused to help in the construction, as did the savage barbarians known as the Dainir. The Colossi and their Jotun allies built the city themselves, completing its initial fortifications in the year 1171 before Enlightenment. The Colossi made their homes in the highest parts of Athenius. The Jotun inhabited the lower reaches of the city, and the other Uranos races were only allowed to settle just within the outermost walls. The ambitious Colossi wished to transform the Uranos from an unstable alliance of pillagers and raiders into a true world power on par with the great kingdoms of Amalur. Throughout these ancient times, the port cities of Amalur hummed with stories spread by mariners who had sailed the sea of secrets south of Adelia. They claimed that the sky above the water shimmered with an ephemeral shifting light visible both night and day. Sailors dubbed this phenomenon the Southern Glimmer, and some claimed to hear the whispers of the gods within the lights. Since mariners were known to be a superstitious lot, and the Sea of Secrets had often been the setting for tall tales and spooky stories, most dismissed these reports as mere fables. Still, some travellers took pains to avoid the area, sensing something otherworldly in those waters. The nature of fate and the weave. Central to understanding the world of Amalur is the concept of fate itself. In this realm, destiny is not merely a philosophical concept, but a tangible force that governs all existence. The weave of fate is an intricate tapestry that predetermines the path of every living being, from the lowliest mortal to the mightiest Fae Lord. This cosmic pattern decides not only how individuals will live, but also precisely when and how they will die. The Fate Weavers serve as interpreters of this grand design, gifted individuals who can read the threads of destiny and peer into the predetermined futures of those around them. These seers hold a unique and often burdensome position in society, for they alone can see the unchangeable fates that await all living things. For a Fate Weaver, knowing that a beloved friend is destined to die on a specific day creates an almost unbearable weight of knowledge. What makes the concept of fate in Amalur so fascinating is its absolute nature. Unlike in our world, where destiny might be viewed as malleable or influenced by choice, in Amalur fate is as immutable as the laws of physics. When a Fate Weaver looks upon someone and sees their death, that vision will come to pass exactly as foreseen. No amount of preparation, warning, or intervention can alter what the weave has determined. This understanding of fate shapes every aspect of life in Amalur. Generals know which battles they are destined to win or lose before they are even fought. Merchants understand which ventures will prosper and which will fail. Lovers can see whether their relationships are fated to last or crumble. Yet despite this knowledge, people continue to live their lives, perhaps finding comfort in the certainty that fate provides, even when that certainty brings pain. The immortal Fae have a particularly complex relationship with fate. While they are bound by the weave like all other beings, their immortal nature means they experience fate differently than mortals. The Fae live in what they call the Great Cycle, endless patterns of death and rebirth that allow them to return to life when they are killed. However, this resurrection is not instantaneous, and the Fae must wait their turn in the cycle before they can return to the world. The Fae divide themselves into two primary courts, the Summer Court and the Winter Court. The Summer Fae embody concepts of growth, renewal, and new life, while the Winter Fae represent decay, ending, and necessary death. Both courts play essential roles in maintaining the natural order, and their actions are governed by the same inexorable fate that binds all other creatures. Yet within this deterministic world, there exists the concept of houses among the Fae. These are not merely political organizations, but embodiments of particular stories or ballads that play out repeatedly through the cycles. The House of Ballads, for instance, lives out tales of heroism and adventure. The House of Sorrows experiences stories of loss and redemption. Each house follows its prescribed narrative, with Fae taking on specific roles within these eternal tales. This brings us to one of the most crucial aspects of fate in Amalur: its relationship to narrative itself. The world seems to understand that it exists within stories, and those stories have power. The Fae houses don't simply experience random events. They live out carefully structured narratives with beginnings, middles, and ends. When a story concludes, it begins anew with different Fae taking on the various roles. The races of Amalur. The Faelands serve as home to numerous races, each bringing their own culture, beliefs and perspectives to this mystical realm. Understanding these different peoples is crucial to grasping the complex political and social dynamics that shape the events of our tale. The human races are relative newcomers to the Faelands, having arrived from distant lands in search of new opportunities and freedom from the constraints of their homelands. They are divided into two distinct groups, each with their own characteristics and cultural practices. The Almen represent the more traditional and religious of the human settlers. These noble people hail from Almere Valley and are noted for their unwavering dedication to establishing divine order in the name of their patron deity, Mitharu. The Almen are deeply religious, bringing with them a strong sense of righteousness and an unshakable belief in the power of faith and divine mandate. Despite being relatively small in number compared to other races, the Almen have worked tirelessly to establish centers of worship throughout the Faelands. They can be found in every region, spreading the word of Mitharu and seeking to bring structure and moral guidance to the often chaotic world around them. Their dedication to their faith makes them natural allies of order and justice, though some might view their religious fervor as inflexible or judgmental. The Almen value honor, duty, and service above personal gain. Many have joined organizations like the Fatesworn, where their dedication to righteous causes can be channeled into protecting the innocent and fighting against the forces of darkness. What they may lack in numbers, they more than make up for in religious conviction and moral certainty. In contrast to their Almen cousins, the Varani represent a more pragmatic and worldly approach to life in the Faelands. These hardy seafaring folk are as comfortable on the high seas as they are in the villages and outposts they inhabit throughout the realm. The Varani have brought commerce and a degree of rough civilization to the wilds of the Faelands, establishing trade routes and mercantile ventures wherever they settle. The Varani are often described as hardened by their maritime lifestyle, equally likely to be pirates, mercenaries, or shrewd merchants, depending on the opportunities that present themselves. They favor practical weapons like swords and daggers, tools that serve them well both in sea battles and in the frequently dangerous world of trade and exploration. While the Varani lack the political motivation that drives the Almen's involvement in larger conflicts, many have found profitable employment fighting in the mortal armies as mercenaries during the ongoing war against the Tuatha. Their battle-hardened fierceness and practical approach to combat has earned them a well-deserved reputation as valuable allies in what seems to be an unwinnable conflict. The Varani value independence, profit, and pragmatic solutions to problems. They are less concerned with grand ideological causes than with the practical matters of survival and prosperity. This makes them excellent traders and explorers, but sometimes puts them at odds with more idealistic races who prioritize noble causes over material gain. The Alfar, commonly referred to as elves by other races, are ancient peoples who predate the human arrival in the Faelands by countless generations. They are divided into two distinct tribes, each representing different philosophical approaches to life and magic. The Liosalfar, or Light Elves, are a proud and ancient people from the frozen lands of the north. They are characterized by their unwavering belief in their own moral authority and their conviction that they are divinely ordained to judge right from wrong under wind, sun, and sky. The Liosalfar pride themselves on meting out what they consider to be even-handed justice. Though others might view their certainty as arrogance, the Liosalfar have a complex relationship with the concept of change. They strive to preserve what they see as the perfect natural order, going so far as to use their magic to freeze their homeland in an idealized state. This resistance to change reflects their deep belief that they have achieved a form of perfection that should be maintained rather than altered. Their culture is persistent throughout the Faelands and can be seen most clearly in the plains of Erathi, where their influence has shaped the very landscape. The Liosalfar believe they have a divine right to any place they make their homes, and they work tirelessly to tame the wilderness according to their vision of order and beauty. The Liosalfar are equally adaptable in combining magic with might or finesse, making them formidable opponents in battle and skilled practitioners of the arcane arts. Their magical traditions are ancient and sophisticated, reflecting thousands of years of study and refinement. The Dokalfar, known as Dark Elves, present a fascinating contrast to their Liosalfar cousins. Where the Light Elves value order and preservation, the Dark Elves have embraced sophistication and subtlety as their primary virtues. The Dokalfar are renowned as sophisticated students of magic and diplomacy, preferring to resolve disputes through grace, intelligence, and when necessary, efficient action taken in silence. The Dokalfar possess an alluring and charismatic presence that makes them compelling to other races. They are the ultimate manipulators, skilled at controlling the actions of others from the shadows while maintaining an air of sophistication and charm. Many find the Dokalfar so compelling that they willingly enter into negotiations with them, regardless of the potential consequences. Their mastery of magic extends far beyond simple combat applications. The Dokalfar understand magic as a tool of diplomacy, manipulation, and social control. They can weave spells that influence emotions, alter perceptions, and create illusions that serve their political and personal goals. The port city of Rathia stands as a testament to Dokalfar culture and achievement. This magnificent settlement showcases their ability to blend magical innovation with practical governance, creating a center of culture and learning that attracts visitors from across the Faelands. However, the relentless war against the Tuatha has put tremendous strain on Dokalfar society, forcing even these diplomatic people into increasingly desperate military action. The relationship between the Liosalfar and Dokalfar is one of the most complex political dynamics in the Faelands. Despite their philosophical differences, the two Alfar tribes have been forced to work together in their fight against the Tuatha Deohn. This alliance of necessity has created tension, as the Light Elves' rigid approach to justice often conflicts with the Dark Elves' more flexible and subtle methods. The Gnomes represent perhaps the most unique race in the Faelands, distinguished not by their physical characteristics, but by their approach to knowledge, innovation, and social organization. These practical and pragmatic people approach all problems and goals with rational thinking and careful analysis. Gnome society is divided into 3 distinct sects, each serving a specific function within their culture. The scholars dedicate themselves to the invention of wondrous magical devices, pushing the boundaries of what is possible through the combination of magic and technology. The Praetorians form a military force renowned for their martial skill and tactical expertise. The Templars serve as political strategists who set the agenda for their culture and guide Gnome society's interaction with the wider world. In the arid land of Dacia, the Gnomes have built the magnificent city of Edessa as a monument to their progress and achievements. This grand metropolis houses the Great Library of Amalur, a storehouse of the world's wisdom and knowledge, containing artifacts that date back to the very dawn of history. Scholars from across the world come to Edessa to study and research, making it a center of learning that rivals any institution in the known world. The Gnomes' approach to magic differs significantly from that of other races. Where the Alfar might view magic as an art form or spiritual practice, the Gnomes treat it as a science to be studied, understood, and improved upon. This rational approach has led to remarkable innovations in magical technology, including the creation of devices that can accomplish what would normally require years of magical training. The Fae and the Great Cycle. To truly understand the events that unfold in Kingdoms of Amalur, Reckoning, we must delve deeply into the nature of the Fae and their relationship with the cosmic forces that govern existence. The Fae are immortal beings who live according to the Great Cycle, an eternal pattern of death, waiting, and rebirth that has governed their existence since time immemorial. Unlike mortals who face permanent death, the Fae experience what might be called conditional immortality. When a Fae dies, their essence travels to the realm of Ashara, a plane of pure magic, where they await their turn to return to the physical world. This process is not instantaneous. The Fae must wait their designated time before they can be reborn, and the length of this waiting period varies according to mysterious cosmic principles. The Great Cycle ensures that the Fae maintain the eternal stories and roles that are essential to the functioning of the natural world. Each Fae has a part to play in these cosmic narratives, and when they die, another will eventually take their place to continue the story. This creates a form of immortality that is both individual and collective, as specific Fae can die permanently, while their roles and stories continue through others. The Fae are organized into two primary courts that represent fundamental aspects of the natural order. The Summer Court embodies growth, renewal, creativity, and the life-giving forces that sustain the world. Summer Fae are associated with beginnings, birth, love, art, and all the positive aspects of existence. They tend to be optimistic, energetic, and focused on creation and preservation. In contrast, the Winter Court represents endings, death, decay, and the necessary destruction that makes room for new growth. Winter Fae embody concepts like judgment, retribution, the passage of time, and the inevitable entropy that affects all things. While this might seem negative, the Winter Court serves an essential function in maintaining cosmic balance, ensuring that nothing becomes stagnant or eternal. Both courts are necessary for the proper functioning of the Great Cycle. Without the Summer Court's creative energy, nothing new would ever be born or grow. Without the Winter Court's destructive force, nothing old would ever die or decay, leading to stagnation and an eventual collapse of the entire system. The relationship between the courts is generally one of respectful opposition rather than outright hostility. They understand that they serve complementary functions, and their conflicts tend to be ritualized rather than genuinely destructive. The ongoing tension between creation and destruction, growth and decay, provides the dynamic energy that keeps the Great Cycle functioning properly. Within each court, the Fae organize themselves into houses that embody specific types of stories or ballads. These houses don't simply exist as political entities. They are living narratives that play out repeatedly through the cycles of Fae existence. Each house has its own characteristic themes, conflicts, and resolutions that define the experiences of its members. The House of Ballads, for instance, specializes in tales of heroism, adventure, and noble sacrifice. Fae who belong to this house find themselves drawn into epic quests, dramatic battles, and stories where brave heroes face overwhelming odds to protect the innocent. These stories follow predictable patterns, but the details change with each telling, ensuring that the narratives remain fresh while maintaining their essential character. The House of Sorrows focuses on tales of loss, redemption, and the bittersweet nature of existence. Their stories often involve tragic lovers, fallen heroes seeking redemption, and the pain that comes with understanding the true nature of life and death. While these might seem like sad stories, they serve an important function in helping both Fae and mortals process difficult emotions and find meaning in suffering. The House of Pride tells stories of ambition, achievement, and the dangerous consequences of hubris. Their narratives often feature powerful figures who seek to transcend their limitations, sometimes succeeding gloriously and sometimes facing spectacular downfalls. These stories serve as both inspiration and warning, showing the potential rewards and risks of great ambition. The House of Seasons embodies the eternal cycle of natural change, with stories that reflect the passage of time and the inevitability of transformation. Their tales often involve characters who must adapt to changing circumstances or learn to accept the passage of time and the changes it brings. The House of Vengeance specializes in stories of justice, retribution, and the consequences of wrongdoing. Their narratives often feature characters seeking to right past wrongs or facing the consequences of their own misdeeds. These stories help maintain moral order by demonstrating that actions have consequences that extend beyond immediate results. What makes the Fae houses particularly fascinating is their relationship to narrative structure itself. The stories they tell are not simply entertainment or cultural expressions, they are fundamental forces that help maintain the stability of reality. By repeatedly enacting these essential narratives, the Fae ensure that the archetypal patterns necessary for cosmic order continue to exist and influence the world. This brings us to a crucial understanding about the nature of reality in Amalur. It is fundamentally narrative in structure. The world exists as a collection of stories, and those stories have their own reality and power. The Fae serve as the guardians and performers of these essential narratives, ensuring that the archetypal patterns that govern existence continue to function properly. When the great cycle is disrupted, as it will be by the events of our tale, the consequences extend far beyond the Fae themselves. The breakdown of these eternal narratives threatens the very structure of reality as the archetypal patterns that maintain cosmic order begin to unravel. The Crystal War begins. As our tale properly begins, the world of Amalur finds itself embroiled in what has become known as the Crystal War, a conflict that threatens to destroy the delicate balance of power that has maintained relative peace in the Faelands for centuries. To understand the magnitude of this crisis, we must examine how this devastating war came to pass. The Winter Court had, for countless ages, fulfilled its role in the Great Cycle as the embodiment of necessary endings and natural decay. The Winter Fae played their parts in the eternal stories, representing death, judgment, and the inevitable conclusion of all things. They were led by High King Mathon, a wise and ancient ruler who understood the importance of maintaining balance between the forces of creation and destruction. Among the Winter Court was a Fae known as Gadflo, who served as the court jester. In Fae society, the role of jester is not merely one of entertainment. It represents the important function of speaking truth through humor and providing perspective through wit. Jesters are often allowed to say things that would be forbidden to others, using comedy to reveal uncomfortable truths or challenge authority in socially acceptable ways. However, Gadflo was not content with his traditional role. According to the ancient lore stones that record these events, Gadflo committed an act that violated the most fundamental principles of Fae society. During what should have been a harmless jest, he took King Mathon's crown and placed it upon his own head, claiming to do so merely as a joke. But this was no innocent prank. In that moment, something fundamental changed within Gadflo. Whether he was already hungry for power or whether some outside influence twisted his mind remains unclear. But the placement of that crown marked the beginning of a catastrophe that would engulf the entire realm. Rather than removing the crown and completing his jest, Gadflo instead drew his weapon and slaughtered every member of the Winter Court. The massacre that followed was unprecedented in Fae history. The Winter Court, ancient and proud, was wiped out in a single night of betrayal and violence. When the heroes of the winter rose to avenge their lost king and remove the mad jester from his stolen throne, they found themselves facing a power unlike anything they had encountered before. Gadflo had somehow gained access to mystical abilities that allowed him to forge weapons and armor from a mysterious crystalline substance called prismia. These weapons were not merely superior in their craftsmanship, they possessed magical properties that made them devastatingly effective against traditional Fae defenses. More terrifyingly, Gadflo used this power to impale the winter heroes upon shards of prismia, preventing them from returning through the Great Cycle. This violation of the fundamental laws of Fae existence sent shockwaves through both courts. The Great Cycle, which had functioned perfectly for uncounted millennia, was suddenly disrupted. The Winter Fae who had been killed by Gadflow's power could not resurrect, breaking the eternal pattern of death and rebirth that defined Fae existence. Gadflow proclaimed himself the new High King of Winter and announced his devotion to a being he called Tirnoch, the Merciful, whom he described as a goddess arising beneath the mountains of Alabastra. He claimed that this new deity had chosen him as her herald and commanded him to wage war against the mortal races that had settled in the Faelands. The surviving Winter Fae found themselves in an impossible position. Their traditional leaders were dead and could not return. Their ancient customs had been violated, and they faced a choice between following the mad usurper who had destroyed their court, or resisting him and facing the same fate as those who had opposed him. Many chose to follow Gadflow, either out of fear or because they had been corrupted by his influence. Those who followed Gadflow became known as the Tuatha Deohn, a name that carries connotations of fanatical devotion and eternal purpose. The Tuatha abandoned the traditional ways of the Winter Court and embraced a new form of existence based entirely on warfare against the mortal races. They believed that their actions were divinely mandated by Tirnoch and that their ultimate victory was assured by their goddess's power. The transformation of the Winter Fae into the Tuatha Deohn represented more than just a political change. It was a fundamental alteration of their nature. Where the Winter Court had represented necessary endings within the natural order, the Tuatha embodied destruction for its own sake. They sought not to maintain balance, but to eliminate the mortal races entirely and reshape the world according to their twisted vision. The Tuatha's first major action was an invasion of the plains of Erathi under the cover of darkness, a brutal assault that the Alfar would forever remember as the Night of Blood and Fire. This surprise attack caught the Elven defenders completely off guard, as they had no reason to expect aggression from the Winter Fae, who had been their allies in maintaining the cosmic balance. The initial assault was devastating. The Tuatha warriors, armed with their Prismere weapons and driven by fanatical devotion to their cause, swept across the plains of Erathi like a plague of destruction. Towns and settlements that had stood for centuries were burned to the ground, their inhabitants killed or enslaved. The ancient trees that the Alfar had tended for generations were cut down or corrupted, their sacred groves defiled by the presence of the Tuatha. The Alfar military, caught unprepared for this unprecedented assault, found themselves overwhelmed by the ferocity and supernatural capabilities of their attackers. Traditional defensive strategies proved ineffective against enemies who could not be permanently killed and who wielded weapons that could pierce any armor or ward. Pushed out of Erathi, the Tuatha regrouped in the region of Cluricon and soon gained new momentum through the actions of Malwyn, a powerful Fae lord known as the Witch Knight of the House of Pride. Malwyn had his own reasons for seeking revenge against the Alfar armies, and he chose to ally himself with Gadflow's cause, bringing with him dark forces of chaos that had been imprisoned for centuries. The addition of these chaotic entities to the Tuatha forces marked a new and even more dangerous phase of the war. Where the initial assault had been brutal, but recognizably within the bounds of conventional warfare, the involvement of chaos entities introduced elements of pure destruction that threatened not just the mortal races, but the very fabric of reality itself. The combined forces of the Tuatha and their chaotic allies proved unstoppable. The elven armies, despite their ancient wisdom and powerful magic, had no choice but to retreat to their fortress of Mel Senshir on what became known as the Day of Pale Swans. This retreat marked the end of Alfar dominance in their traditional territories and the beginning of a siege that would last for years. Mel Senshir, ancient and magnificent, represented the last bastion of organized resistance against the Tuatha onslaught. The fortress had been built in ages past to withstand any conceivable assault, its walls protected by layers of magical wards, and its defenders trained in the arts of war that had been perfected over millennia. Yet even this mighty stronghold could only slow, not stop, the Tuatha advance. The siege of Melsenshir became a symbol of the desperate nature of the mortal race's situation. While the fortress could withstand direct assault, its defenders slowly dwindled as the war dragged on. The Tuatha, by contrast, seemed to grow stronger with each passing month, their numbers replenished by new converts to their cause, and their power enhanced by the mysterious abilities granted by their goddess. The Well of Souls. While the Crystal War raged across the Faelands, threatening to destroy everything the mortal races had built, a secret project was underway that would ultimately change the course of history. In hidden laboratories far from the battlefields, brilliant gnomish scientists were working on what they believed could be the key to ending the war and saving their people from extinction. The gnomes, with their characteristic blend of scientific reasoning and magical innovation, had identified what they saw as the fundamental problem facing the mortal races: the inevitability of death. While the Fae could return from death through the Great Cycle, mortals faced permanent oblivion when they fell in battle. This asymmetry meant that every casualty suffered by the mortal forces was irreplaceable, while the Tuatha could continue fighting indefinitely. The solution, as conceived by the brilliant gnomish inventor Fomerus Hughes, was revolutionary in its scope and ambition. Hughes proposed creating a device that could extract the soul of a recently deceased individual, reconstruct their physical body, and return their soul to that reconstructed form, effectively achieving resurrection for mortals. This device, which came to be known as the Well of Souls, represented the pinnacle of gnomish magical engineering. The theory behind its operation required a deep understanding of both the nature of souls and the magical forces that bound spirit to flesh. Hughes and his team spent years perfecting the delicate balance of energies required to make such a resurrection possible. The project was conducted in absolute secrecy, for the implications of success were staggering. If the Well of Souls could reliably restore life to the dead, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power, not just in the current war, but in the cosmic order itself. The ability to cheat death had always been the exclusive domain of the Fae, and extending this capability to mortals would represent a challenge to the fundamental laws that governed existence. Hughes was not working alone in this endeavor. His former partner, a gnome named Ventrinio, had also been exploring the possibilities of soul manipulation and resurrection. However, Ventrinio's approach differed significantly from Hughes' methodology, and the two had separated to pursue their respective visions of how such technology might be implemented. The Well of Souls required a tremendous amount of magical energy to operate, energy that could only be provided by prismere crystals. These mysterious gems, which had first appeared with the rise of the Tuatha, possessed unique properties that made them ideal for storing and channeling magical forces. However, obtaining sufficient quantities of prismere for the project required dangerous expeditions into Tuatha-controlled territory. As the project neared completion, Hughes became aware that they would need someone willing to test the device under actual battlefield conditions. The Well of Souls had shown promise in initial trials, but its effectiveness could only be truly verified by attempting to resurrect someone who had died in the violent circumstances of war. This need for a test subject would ultimately connect to a secret organization that had been operating in the shadows throughout the Crystal War. This clandestine group, whose very existence was known only to a select few, had a mission that extended far beyond the current conflict. They were the guardians of secrets so dangerous that their revelation could threaten not just the war effort, but the stability of reality itself. The organization's primary purpose was to maintain the imprisonment of an ancient entity known as Tirnoch, a being of immense power whose release could bring about the destruction of all life in Amalur. The members of this secret order understood that Tirnoch was not truly a goddess, as Gadflow proclaimed, but rather an ancient Fey dragon whose malevolence and power made her one of the most dangerous entities ever to exist. Tirnoch had been imprisoned for tens of thousands of years, sealed away by the ancient Alfar in a prison located beneath the Winter Fey capital of Baile. The The prison existed in a limbo state between the physical world and the plane of magic known as Eshara, making it virtually impossible for Tirnoch to escape through conventional means. However, the members of the secret organization had detected signs that Tirnoch's prison was weakening. The rise of Gadflow and the Tuatha Deohn was not coincidental. It was part of a carefully orchestrated plan by Tirnoch to secure her release. The Prismere crystals that gave the Tuatha their supernatural weapons were actually physical manifestations of Tirnoch's power leaking into the mortal world, growing stronger as her prison weakened. The secret organization knew that they needed to act before Tirnoch could complete her escape, but their attempts to infiltrate the Tuatha strongholds and assassinate Gadflow had failed. It was in this desperate situation that one member of the organization volunteered for what appeared to be a suicide mission, to penetrate the heart of the Tuatha territory and attempt to reseal Tirnoch's prison. This volunteer was an individual of exceptional skill and ruthless determination, someone described by those who knew them as cunning, resourceful, and coldly efficient. According to later accounts, this person was very resourceful and served as an excellent assistant to their colleagues, though they were also described as unpleasant and a terror to be around. Their personality was apparently more vile than that of Tirnoch herself, suggesting a level of moral flexibility that made them ideally suited for the darkest kinds of missions. To create a cover for their infiltration mission, this agent allowed themselves to be hired by Templar Octien as a personal assistant to Ventrinio, Hugh's former partner, who was working on his own version of the Well of Souls. This position gave them access to the resources and contacts they needed, while maintaining their cover as a simple research assistant. Working to assist Ventrinio in his research, the agent proved to be extraordinarily effective at gathering the massive amounts of Prismere needed to power his well. Ventrinio was so impressed by their efforts that he made a fateful decision. He attuned the agent's soul to his Well of Souls, creating a mystical connection that would prove crucial in later events. After gathering enough Prismere to satisfy Ventrinio's immediate needs, the agents secretly departed on their true mission. They told Ventrinio only that they were going to search for the true source of the Prismere, concealing their real intention to assassinate Gadflow and reseal Tirnoch's prison. The mission proceeded exactly as the Fate Weavers had predicted. The agent failed in their attempt to kill Gadflow and reseal Tirnoch. They were captured and killed in the city of Alabastra, dying in agony as their fate had foretold. But their death was not the end of their story. It was, in fact, the beginning of something far more significant. Unknown to anyone at the time, Tirnoch had been aware of the agent's mission from the beginning. The ancient dragon had learned to perceive events beyond her prison, and she had been manipulating circumstances to serve her own purposes. Rather than seeing the agent as a threat, Tirnoch recognized them as an opportunity. The dragon realized that Gadflow, while useful, was ultimately limited in what he could accomplish. His fanatical devotion made him an excellent tool for waging war and weakening her prison, but he lacked the special qualities needed to complete her release. What Tirnoch needed was someone who existed outside the normal constraints of fate, someone whose actions could not be predicted or prevented by the Fate Weavers who opposed her. By ensuring that the agent died while their soul was attuned to Ventrinio's Well of Souls, Tirnoch created the perfect conditions for their eventual resurrection. When Hughes activated his own Well of Souls, the mystical connection established by Ventrinio would draw the agent's soul to the device, bringing them back to life as the first and only successful resurrection. But this resurrection would come with an unexpected consequence. The agent would return to life free from the weave of fate that bound all other beings. Death had severed their connection to destiny, and their resurrection outside the normal cosmic order meant they could act without their future being predetermined by the cosmic forces that governed everyone else. This was exactly what Tirnoch had planned. She needed an agent who could act without constraint, someone whose choices could not be foreseen or prevented. The resurrected agent, who would become known as the Fateless One, was intended to be Tirnok's ultimate tool for securing her freedom. However, Tirnok's plan contained a fatal flaw in severing the agent's connection to fate. The resurrection had also erased their memories of their previous life, including their mission and their allegiance to the secret organization. The Fateless One would awaken with no knowledge of their past, no understanding of their true purpose, and no awareness of the cosmic forces that had manipulated their death and rebirth. The Fateless One awakens. The Well of Souls laboratory, hidden deep in the forests of Dalantarth, had seen many failures in its attempts to restore life to the dead. Corpses lay scattered throughout the facility, testament to experiments that had fallen short of their ambitious goals. It was into this charnel house that consciousness slowly returned to one particular body, buried beneath a pile of failed resurrection attempts. The first sensation was confusion. Awakening in darkness, surrounded by the cold flesh of the dead, with no memory of how or why this had come to pass. The individual who would become known as the Fateless One clawed their way out from beneath the corpses, emerging into a world that seemed both familiar and utterly alien. The facility around them showed clear signs of recent violence. Scorch marks on the walls, shattered equipment, and the acrid smell of magical energies discharged in combat suggested that the laboratory had been under attack. In the distance, the sound of explosions and the clash of weapons indicated that the battle was still ongoing. Fomerus Hughes, the brilliant gnome responsible for creating the Well of Souls, appeared as if from nowhere, his face a mixture of amazement and terror. The resurrection had worked, the first and only time the device had successfully restored life to the dead. But there was no time to celebrate or even fully comprehend what had been accomplished. "Hughes needs to see you," the gnome said urgently. "Right now, you are the most valuable thing in his world." But even as he spoke, the sounds of battle grew closer. The Tuatha Deohn had discovered the location of the Well of Souls, and they were determined to destroy it before it could be used to grant immortality to the mortal races. The newly awakened Fateless One found themselves thrust immediately into combat, forced to fight for their life against Tuatha warriors, while still struggling to understand their own existence. The knowledge of how to fight seemed to come naturally, muscle memory returning, even as conscious memory remained absent. They wielded weapons with instinctive skill, suggesting extensive training in their previous life. Hughes fought desperately to buy time for his creation to escape, using his scientific knowledge and magical devices to hold off the Tuatha assault. "I've seen the fate of every soldier in that battle," he would later say, "and none of them were to survive past that day. I do not know what you are or how you are doing whatever it is you are doing, but I am glad you are on our side." The Tuatha had come prepared to completely destroy the Well of Souls facility. They planted magical explosives throughout the structure, devices designed to ensure that no trace of the resurrection technology would survive. The implications of mortals gaining the ability to cheat death were too dangerous for the Tuatha to allow, threatening as it did the cosmic order that gave them their advantages in the ongoing war. As the facility began to collapse around them, Hughes made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure his creation could escape. He held off the Tuatha assault long enough for the Fateless One to flee into the forests of Dalantarth, though the effort cost him his freedom and nearly his life. The gnome was captured by the Tuatha, but managed to survive, though he would bear the scars of his ordeal for the rest of his days. The Fateless One emerged from the burning laboratory into a world at war, carrying nothing but the clothes on their back, and the growing realization that they were somehow different from everyone around them. The resurrection had changed them in ways that would only become apparent gradually as they began to interact with the world and discover the extent of their unique abilities. Their first destination was a small settlement where they encountered other survivors of Tuatha attacks. The people they met seemed ordinary enough, but there was something in their eyes when they looked upon the Fateless One, a mixture of hope and fear that suggested they sensed something unusual about this mysterious stranger. It was in these early encounters that the Fateless One began to realize the true scope of what had happened to them. When they spoke with people about their futures, the responses were unlike anything that would normally be expected. Instead of the resigned acceptance that characterized most people's relationship with their predetermined fates, these individuals began to speak of possibilities, of choices, of futures that might be different from what had been foretold. The Fateless One was not simply immune to fate. Their very presence was somehow disrupting the weave of fate around them. People who came into contact with them found their predetermined destinies beginning to unravel, replaced by genuine choice and uncertainty. This was both liberating and terrifying, as it meant that the fundamental certainty that had governed life in Amalur for millennia was suddenly called into question. Hughes had instructed the Fateless One to seek out a man named Agarth, describing him as someone who might be able to explain what had happened and provide guidance for the difficult path ahead. Agarth was known as a fate weaver, one of those gifted individuals who could read the threads of destiny and foresee the futures of those around them. Agarth and the revelation of destiny. The journey to find Agarth led the Fateless One through the war-torn countryside of Dalantarth, where the effects of the Tuatha incursion were visible everywhere. Burned villages, corrupted forests, and refugees fleeing the advancing enemy forces painted a picture of a world in crisis. Yet wherever the Fateless One traveled, something remarkable began to happen. Soldiers who had been told by fate weavers that they would die in upcoming battles suddenly found themselves surviving encounters that should have been fatal. Merchants who had foreseen the failure of their ventures discovered unexpected success. Lovers who had been destined to part found their relationships taking new and unexpected directions. The very presence of the Fateless One was rewriting destiny on a local scale. Agarth proved to be a complex and troubled individual, a former warrior who had discovered his ability to read fate and become a fate weaver, though the knowledge of future deaths and tragedies had driven him to drink heavily as a means of coping with the burden of his gift. When the Fateless One finally located him, Agarth's reaction was one of complete disbelief. "I cannot see your future," Agarth said, staring at the Fateless One with a mixture of wonder and fear. "I have never encountered anyone whose fate I could not read. You exist outside the weave, free from the destiny that binds everyone else in this world. But that should be impossible. Nothing and no one can exist outside of fate." The implications of this revelation were staggering. If the Fateless One truly existed outside the weave of fate, they represented something unprecedented in the history of Amalur. They were not simply an anomaly. They were a fundamental challenge to the cosmic order that had governed existence since the beginning of time. Agarth's initial skepticism gradually gave way to amazement as he witnessed the effects of the Fateless One's presence firsthand. Predictions that he had made with absolute certainty began to fail. Events that he had foreseen as inevitable simply did not come to pass. The very foundations of his understanding of reality were being shaken by this impossible individual. To test the extent of the Fateless One's abilities, Agarth led them to a Fate Weaver temple, an ancient site where the most important prophecies and destinies were recorded. It was here that they hoped to find answers about what the Fateless One truly was and what their existence might mean for the future of Amalur. The temple contained a Fey Codex, an ancient artifact that recorded all of Amalur's history and held prophecies about its future. This codex was said to be infallible, its predictions having never been wrong throughout the ages. If anyone could provide answers about the Fateless One's nature and purpose, it would be this ancient repository of knowledge, but even approaching the temple proved to be a test of the Fateless One's unique nature. Agarth had foreseen his own death at this location, a vision that had haunted him for years. according to his gift, he was destined to die in the temple, killed by guardians who would view his presence as a violation of sacred law. However, when they arrived at the temple, something unprecedented occurred. The Fateless One's presence somehow prevented Agarth's fated death, allowing him to survive an encounter that should have been fatal. This demonstrated beyond any doubt that the Fateless One could not only change their own fate, but could alter the destinies of others simply by being near them. The Codex, when consulted, provided information that was both enlightening and deeply troubling. It spoke of the Fateless One's role in either saving or destroying Amalur, though the exact nature of this role remained maddeningly unclear. The Codex seemed to struggle with the very concept of someone who existed outside fate, its normally precise prophecies becoming vague and contradictory when applied to the Fateless One. What the Codex did make clear was that the Fateless One's existence represented a crucial turning point in the history of Amalur. Their actions would determine whether the world survived the current crisis or was consumed by forces that sought its destruction. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming, particularly for someone who had no memory of their past or understanding of their true nature. It was during their time at the temple that the Fateless One first encountered Alin Shur, a mysterious Dokalfar woman who appeared to know them from their previous life. Alin Shur was clearly more than she appeared to be, possessing skills and knowledge that suggested involvement in the same secret organization that had originally sent the Fateless One on their fatal mission. However, Alin Shur was reluctant to reveal the full truth about the Fateless One's past, claiming that such knowledge was too dangerous to share openly. She hinted at secrets that could threaten the stability of the world if they became widely known, suggesting that the Fateless One's previous mission had involved forces far more dangerous than the current war against the Tuatha. The interaction between the Fateless One and Alin Shur was charged with unspoken history and hidden meanings. It was clear that they had once been close allies, perhaps even friends, but the resurrection had changed the Fateless One in ways that created a barrier between them. The person Alin Shur had once known was gone, replaced by someone with the same face, but a completely different personality and set of memories. The power of choice. As the Fateless One began to understand the true scope of their abilities, they found themselves facing choices that would have been impossible for anyone else in Amalur. Where others were bound by the predetermined paths laid out by the weave of fate, the Fateless One could choose their own destiny and, more importantly, could help others choose theirs as well. This power of choice manifested itself in countless ways as the Fateless One traveled through the war-torn regions of the Faelands. They encountered soldiers who had been told they would die in battle, but who, through the Fateless One's intervention, survived to see their families again. They met merchants who had foreseen failure but found success, artists who had been destined for obscurity but achieved recognition, and lovers who had been fated to part but found ways to stay together. Each of these interventions sent ripples through the weave of fate, creating changes that extended far beyond the immediate individuals involved. A soldier who survived a battle he was meant to die in might go on to save others, who would then survive to influence still more lives. A merchant who succeeded against fate might provide resources that changed the course of the war. An artist who achieved recognition might create works that inspired future generations. The cumulative effect of these changes was to introduce genuine uncertainty into a world that had been rigidly predetermined. For the first time in the history of Amalur, the future was not fixed. People could make choices that mattered, decisions that could alter not just their own lives, but the fate of the entire world. This newfound freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. On one hand, it offered hope where there had been only despair, possibility where there had been only resignation. On the other hand, it meant that the comfortable certainty of predetermined fate was replaced by the anxiety of genuine responsibility for one's choices. The Fate Weavers found themselves in a particularly difficult position as the influence of the Fateless One spread. Their entire identity was built around their ability to see the future, but the Fateless One's presence made their visions unreliable. Predictions that had once been absolute began to fail, and the Fate Weavers struggled to understand their role in a world where fate was no longer fixed. Some Fate Weavers embraced this change, seeing it as liberation from the burden of knowing terrible futures they could not prevent. Others resisted it, viewing the breakdown of fate as a catastrophe that threatened the fundamental order of existence. A few began to question whether fate had ever been as fixed as they had believed, wondering if the weave had always contained the possibility of change that only the Fateless One could reveal. The Fae reaction to the Fateless One was particularly complex. As immortal beings whose existence was entirely structured around predetermined roles and stories, they found the concept of someone free from fate both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The Summer Fae, with their association with growth and change, were generally more accepting of the Fateless One's nature. The Winter Fae, particularly those not corrupted by the Tuatha, viewed the breakdown of fate with deep concern. King Titarian of the Summer Court expressed particular interest in the Fateless One, recognizing both the potential benefits and dangers of their unique nature. The Summer Fae had always been associated with change and growth, making them more adaptable to the idea of a future that was not predetermined. However, even they understood that unlimited change could be as destructive as total stagnation. The world tree Niralim, an ancient entity of immense power and wisdom, showed obvious concern about the implications of the Fateless One's existence. As a being tied to the fundamental forces that governed natural growth and cosmic order, Niralim understood better than most how the breakdown of fate could affect the stability of reality itself. These reactions from powerful supernatural entities highlighted a crucial aspect of the Fateless One's situation. While their power to change fate offered hope for ending the war and saving the mortal races, it also represented a potential threat to the cosmic order that had maintained the world's stability for millennia. The question was whether this change would ultimately prove beneficial or catastrophic. The war intensifies. As news of the Fateless One's unique abilities began to spread, both through rumors and through the increasingly erratic behavior of fate itself, the various factions involved in the Crystal War began to reassess their strategies and positions. The war was no longer simply a conflict between the mortal races and the Tuatha Deohn. It had become a struggle over the very nature of reality and the role of destiny in shaping the world. The Tuatha response to reports of the Fateless One was swift and decisive. Gadflo recognized immediately that someone who could disrupt fate represented an existential threat to his plans and to the goddess he served. If the Fateless One could prevent the predetermined victory of the Tuatha, then everything Gadflo had worked toward could be undone. Tuatha forces began actively hunting for the Fateless One, launching increasingly desperate attacks against any location where they might be found. These assaults were characterized by a level of ferocity that exceeded even the Tuatha's normal brutality, suggesting that Gadflo viewed the elimination of the Fateless One as his highest priority. However, the Tuatha's efforts to locate and eliminate the Fateless One were hampered by the very nature of their target. Because the Fateless One existed outside fate, their movements and actions could not be predicted through the usual methods of divination and foresight that the Tuatha employed. This made them effectively invisible to the supernatural tracking methods that had proven so effective against other enemies. The mortal armies, meanwhile, began to experience something they had not felt in years: hope. Reports of victories that should have been impossible, of soldiers surviving battles they were meant to lose, and of strategic successes that had not been foreseen began to filter through the ranks. While few understood the true source of these changes, the psychological impact was enormous. General Telera Apiguidion, The Lyoselfar military leader, who had been conducting a fighting retreat against the Tuatha for years, found herself cautiously optimistic for the first time since the war began. Her strategic situation had not fundamentally changed, but the increasing unpredictability of battle outcomes meant that clever tactics and superior planning could once again make a difference. The siege of Melsentia, which had seemed destined to end in defeat for the Alfar defenders, began to show signs of hope. Supplies that should have been intercepted reached the fortress. Reinforcements arrived when they should have been ambushed, and Tuatha assaults that had been predicted to succeed instead failed catastrophically. Tilera recognized that these changes were somehow connected to reports of the mysterious individual who had survived the destruction of the Well of Souls facility. Though she had not yet met the Fateless One personally, she understood that their existence represented the best hope for breaking the siege and potentially turning the tide of the entire war. It was during this period of growing hope and changing fortunes that the Fateless One began to take on increasingly important missions that would test the full extent of their abilities. Working with a Garth who had become both guide and friend, they began to investigate the deeper mysteries behind the Tuatha's supernatural powers and the source of their seemingly endless reinforcements. These investigations led them into some of the most dangerous territories in the Faelands, places where the influence of the Tuatha had corrupted the very landscape itself. Ancient forests had been twisted into nightmarish parodies of their former selves, their trees bearing crystalline growths of prismere that pulsed with malevolent energy. Sacred sites had been defiled and converted into shrines to Tirnoch, where Tuatha priests conducted rituals designed to weaken the barriers between the physical world and the realm of their imprisoned goddess. The Fateless One's ability to change fate proved crucial in these investigations. Where other scouts and spies had been detected and killed according to predetermined patterns, the Fateless One could move through enemy territory with relative impunity, their unpredictable nature making them nearly impossible to anticipate or counter. Through these reconnaissance missions, the Fateless One began to piece together a picture of the Tuatha's true objectives. The war against the mortal races was not an end in itself, but rather a means to a larger goal. The massive expenditure of magical energy involved in the conflict, the deliberate corruption of sacred sites, and the increasing number of rituals being conducted all pointed toward a single purpose: the weakening of whatever mystical barriers were keeping Tirnoch imprisoned. This revelation added a new urgency to the war effort. If the Tuatha succeeded in freeing their goddess, the consequences would extend far beyond the current conflict. According to the ancient texts that Agarth had consulted, Tirnoch's freedom would threaten not just the Faelands, but potentially the entire world. The knowledge that time was running out led to increasingly desperate measures on all sides. The Alfar forces under Tilera's command began planning more aggressive operations, attempting to disrupt Tuatha rituals and destroy their Prismere installations before the damage became irreversible. The human settlements began organizing evacuation plans, preparing to flee to distant lands if the war could not be won. The Fateless One found themselves at the center of these escalating efforts, their unique abilities making them the most valuable asset in the struggle against the Tuatha. But with this importance came increasing pressure and the growing realization that the fate of the world might ultimately rest on their decisions. The faction wars. While the larger conflict between the mortal races and the Tuatha Deohn dominated the headlines and commanded the attention of military leaders, the Fateless One discovered that the crisis had created opportunities for numerous smaller organizations to pursue their own agendas. These factions, each with their own goals and philosophies, offered the Fateless One chances to experience different aspects of life in Amalur, while contributing to the war effort in various ways. The House of Ballads represented one of the most fascinating of these organizations, being a Fae house that had chosen to welcome mortal members into their ranks. This decision was unprecedented in Fae history, as the houses had traditionally been exclusive to their immortal members. However, The disruption caused by the Crystal War had forced even the ancient Fae to adapt to changing circumstances. The House of Ballads specialized in living out stories of heroism, adventure, and noble sacrifice. Their tales were not mere entertainment, but actual experiences that the house members lived through repeatedly across the cycles of Fae existence. By joining this house, mortals could participate in these eternal stories, experiencing adventures that had been refined and perfected over countless iterations. For the Fateless One, the House of Ballads offered something particularly unique. Because they existed outside fate, their participation in the house's stories could fundamentally alter those narratives, introducing genuine uncertainty and choice into tales that had been predetermined for millennia. This created the possibility of new endings, different outcomes, and entirely fresh interpretations of ancient ballads. The stories of the House of Ballads ranged from epic quests to rescue captive princesses to tragic tales of heroes who must choose between love and duty. Each story had its own cast of characters, its own challenges, and its own moral dilemmas. The Fateless One could take on different roles within these narratives, experiencing the full range of heroic archetypes while contributing to the house's ongoing mission. What made the House of Ballads particularly relevant to the current crisis was their role as inspirational figures for the mortal armies. The stories they enacted were not just entertainment. They served as examples of courage, sacrifice, and honor that could inspire ordinary soldiers to extraordinary acts of bravery. By participating in these tales, the Fateless One could help boost morale and encourage the kind of heroic thinking that would be necessary to win the war. The Scholia Arcana represented the other extreme of intellectual pursuit, being an organization dedicated to the advancement of magical knowledge and understanding. Where the House of Ballads focused on emotional and inspirational truth, the Scholia Arcana sought objective knowledge about the nature of magic, reality, and the forces that governed existence. The magical scholars of the Scholia Arcana had been deeply interested in the reports of someone who existed outside fate, seeing the Fateless One as a unique opportunity to study the nature of destiny itself. Their investigations into the magical theories underlying fate and free will had important implications for the war effort, as understanding these forces might reveal new ways to combat the Tuatha's supernatural advantages. The Scholia Arcana's research into the nature of prisma crystals had yielded important insights into the source of the Tuatha's power. They had determined that the crystals were not simply magical storage devices, but were actually physical manifestations of Turnok's influence leaking into the material world. This discovery suggested that the crystals could be used to track the weakening of the goddess's prison and predict when her escape might become possible. By working with the Scholia Arcana, the Fateless One could contribute to these crucial research efforts while gaining a deeper understanding of their own unique nature. The scholars were eager to study someone who could manipulate fate, seeing them as a living laboratory for testing theories about the fundamental nature of reality. The Fatersworn represented a more traditional military organization, dedicated to protecting the innocent and maintaining order during the chaos of war. This group attracted many Almain members, whose religious dedication to justice and righteousness aligned well with the Fatersworn's mission. However, the organization welcomed members from all races who shared their commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The Fatersworn's approach to the war was straightforward and honorable, focusing on direct military action against the Tuatha forces while maintaining the highest standards of conduct and ethics. They served as the backbone of the organized resistance against the Tuatha, providing structure and leadership for the scattered mortal forces that had been driven from their homes. For the Fateless One, joining the Fatersworn offered an opportunity to participate directly in the military aspect of the war while upholding the values of honor and justice that the organization embodied. The Fatersworn's missions ranged from rescuing captured civilians to disrupting Tuatha supply lines to defending strategic locations against enemy assault. The organization's emphasis on honor and ethical conduct provided an interesting contrast to the Fateless One's previous life, where they had apparently been willing to use any means necessary to accomplish their goals. The choice of whether to embrace these higher standards or revert to more pragmatic approaches represented one of the many ways in which the Fateless One could define their new identity. The Travelers represented perhaps the most mysterious of the organizations that the Fateless One could join, being a secretive group whose true purpose remained hidden behind layers of misdirection and carefully constructed cover stories. On the surface, they appeared to be a simple trading company, moving goods and information between the scattered settlements of the Faelands. However, careful observation revealed that the Travelers' activities extended far beyond simple commerce. They seemed to have access to information and resources that would be impossible for ordinary merchants to obtain, and their members displayed skills that suggested extensive training in espionage and infiltration techniques. The Travelers' true mission appeared to be connected to the broader supernatural forces at work in the world, possibly including the same secret organization that had originally employed the Fateless One before their death. Working with the Travelers offered the possibility of uncovering more information about the Fateless One's past, while contributing to efforts that might be crucial to winning the war. Each of these factions offered the Fateless One different perspectives on the nature of heroism, duty, and the proper response to the crisis facing Amalur. By participating in their various missions and activities, the Fateless One could explore different aspects of their own identity, while making meaningful contributions to the war effort. Allies in the darkness. As the Fateless One's reputation grew and their influence on the course of the war became more apparent, they began to attract a diverse group of allies who would prove crucial in the struggles ahead. These companions each brought their own unique skills, knowledge, and perspectives to the growing resistance against the Tuatha threat. Agarth remained the Fateless One's most consistent companion and advisor, his knowledge of fate and his experience as a former warrior making him invaluable in both strategic planning and day-to-day survival. However, Agarth's relationship with the Fateless One was complex, colored by his growing realization that his own abilities as a Fate Weaver were becoming increasingly unreliable. The presence of the Fateless One seemed to create a zone of uncertainty around them that made traditional divination and prophecy impossible. While this protected them from enemy seers and Fate Weavers, it also meant that Agarth could no longer rely on his gift to guide their decisions. This forced him to adapt to a more intuitive and experiential approach to problem solving, relying on his warrior's instincts rather than supernatural foresight. Agarth's personal struggle with the breakdown of fate paralleled the larger crisis facing Amalur as a whole. His gradual acceptance of uncertainty and his development of new ways of understanding the world served as a model for how others might adapt to the changing nature of reality. His friendship with the Fateless One also provided emotional stability and human connection that helped ground them in their new identity. Alan Scher's relationship with the Fateless One was far more complicated, weighted down by secrets from their shared past, and the tension between who they had been and who they were becoming. As a Dockelfar with extensive training in diplomacy and espionage, Alan possessed skills that were perfectly suited to the complex political and military situation they faced. Her knowledge of the secret organization that had employed them both before the Fateless One's death made her one of the few people who understood the true scope of the threat posed by Tirnoch. However, her reluctance to reveal the full truth about their past created ongoing tension and mistrust that complicated their working relationship. Alan's sophisticated understanding of politics and intrigue provided a necessary counterbalance to the more direct approaches favored by other members of their group. Her ability to navigate complex social situations and her skill at gathering information through subtle means proved invaluable in uncovering the Tuatha's plans and identifying potential allies among the various factions vying for power. The developing relationship between Alan and the Fateless One also served as an ongoing reminder of the person they had once been. Through her reactions and comments, the Fateless One could catch glimpses of their previous personality and methods, creating a complex dynamic between their past and present selves. Fomorous Hughes, when he was eventually rescued from Tuatha captivity, brought a wealth of scientific and magical knowledge that proved crucial in understanding the supernatural forces at work in the conflict. His experience with the Well of Souls and his understanding of the relationship between soul, body, and magical energy provided insights that helped explain the Fateless One's unique nature. Hughes also served as a link to the broader scientific community of gnomes, who were working to develop new weapons and defenses against the Tuatha threat. His connections and reputation opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, providing access to experimental technologies and theoretical knowledge that could tip the balance of the war. The gnome's pragmatic approach to problem solving and his willingness to push the boundaries of conventional magic and science made him an ideal collaborator for someone whose very existence challenged the established order. His enthusiasm for studying the Fateless One's abilities, while sometimes uncomfortable for the subject, led to important discoveries about the nature of fate and free will. General Talera A.P. Gwydion represented the military aspect of the resistance, bringing decades of strategic experience and an intimate understanding of Alfar military capabilities to their efforts. Her leadership of the siege defense at Mel Senshur had demonstrated her tactical brilliance and her ability to maintain morale in desperate circumstances. Talera's knowledge of Alfar history and culture proved invaluable in understanding the historical context of the current crisis. Her familiarity with ancient sites, forgotten archives, and traditional defensive strategies provided access to resources that had been overlooked by others. Her connections within the Alfar military hierarchy also facilitated cooperation between different factions of the resistance. The general's personal investment in the war's outcome added an emotional dimension to their strategic planning. Having witnessed the devastation wrought by the Tuatha across her homeland, Talera was motivated not just by duty, but by a deep desire for justice and restoration. Her willingness to sacrifice herself for the greater good would ultimately prove both inspiring and tragic. As these allies worked together, they began to form a cohesive unit that was greater than the sum of its parts. Each member's strengths compensated for the other's weaknesses, creating a balanced team capable of handling the diverse challenges they would face. The Fateless One's unique abilities served as the catalyst that made their cooperation possible, their freedom from fate, allowing them to bring together individuals whose destinies might otherwise have kept them apart. The road to Mel Senshur. The growing alliance between the Fateless One and their companions eventually led to their involvement in one of the most crucial battles of the Crystal War, the attempt to break the siege of Mel Senshur. This ancient Alfar fortress had become the symbol of resistance against the Tuatha, its continued survival serving as proof that the mortal races could still stand against the seemingly unstoppable enemy forces. The siege had lasted for years, with the Tuatha forces gradually tightening their grip around the fortress, while the defenders inside slowly dwindled in number. Supply lines had been cut, reinforcements had been blocked, and the magical barriers protecting the fortress were beginning to weaken under constant assault. According to every prediction made by the Fate Weavers, Mel Senshur was doomed to fall, its defenders destined to die in a final, futile battle. However, the presence of the Fateless One changed these calculations completely. For the first time since the siege began, there was genuine uncertainty about the outcome. The predetermined fate that had sealed the fortress's doom was no longer absolute, creating opportunities for tactics and strategies that had previously been impossible. General Talera had been planning a desperate breakout attempt, a final gambit that might allow at least some of her forces to escape, even if the fortress itself could not be saved. Her plans were based on accepting the inevitable fall of Mel Senshur while trying to minimize the casualties and preserve as much of the Alpha military capability as possible. The Fateless One's arrival forced a complete reassessment of these plans. If fate could be changed, then perhaps the siege itself could be broken rather than simply survived. This possibility opened up new strategic options that had been unthinkable under the old certainties of predetermined destiny. Working with Telera and her staff, the Fateless One began to develop a new approach to the siege that took advantage of their unique abilities. Rather than accepting the defensive posture that fate had imposed, they would go on the offensive, using the unpredictability of their actions to confuse and disrupt the Tuatha assault. The first phase of this new strategy involved gathering intelligence about the Tuatha positions and capabilities surrounding the fortress. Traditional reconnaissance had been impossible because the enemy could predict and counter any conventional scouting attempts. However, the Fateless One's immunity to fate made them effectively invisible to the supernatural detection methods that the Tuatha employed. Through a series of carefully planned infiltration missions, the Fateless One was able to map the Tuatha positions, identify key leaders and objectives, and discover weaknesses in their siege lines that had not been apparent from within the fortress. This intelligence revealed that the Tuatha forces, while powerful, were not as invulnerable as they appeared. The Tuatha's confidence in their predetermined victory had made them somewhat complacent in their siege tactics. They had positioned their forces according to what fate had told them would be necessary to defeat the expected defensive strategies, but they had not prepared for the kind of unpredictable assault that the Fateless One could enable. The second phase involved coordinating with resistance forces outside the siege perimeter to create a simultaneous attack from multiple directions. These external forces had been operating independently, their efforts hampered by the certainty that any major assault on the siege lines was doomed to failure. The Fateless One's ability to change fate made it possible to coordinate these scattered forces into a unified offensive. The plan that emerged was ambitious and dangerous, requiring precise timing and perfect coordination between forces that had little experience working together. The fortress defenders would launch a breakout assault at the same moment that external forces attacked the Tuatha rear positions, while the Fateless One and their companions struck at key targets that would disrupt the enemy's command structure. The success of this plan depended entirely on the Fateless One's ability to prevent the Tuatha from predicting and countering their movements. If the enemy could foresee their actions, the entire assault would collapse before it began. However, if they could maintain the element of surprise, the coordinated attack might be sufficient to break the siege that had seemed unbreakable. The night before the assault, the defenders of Mel Senshir experienced something they had not felt in years: hope. For the first time since the siege began, they were not simply preparing to die in a predetermined battle, but were instead planning for the possibility of victory. The psychological impact of this change was enormous, transforming the fortress from a place of despair into a launching point for counterattack. Breaking the siege. The assault on the Tuatha siege lines began before dawn, with coordinated attacks striking at multiple points simultaneously. The fortress gates opened for the first time in years as Alfar forces poured out to engage the enemy, while external resistance fighters attacked from the flanks and rear. The Fateless One and their companions penetrated deep into Tuatha territory to strike at the command centers that coordinated the siege. The initial impact of the assault was everything the planners had hoped for. The Tuatha forces, caught completely off guard by an attack they had not foreseen, scrambled to respond to threats coming from directions they had not expected. Their carefully prepared defensive positions proved ineffective against attacks that came from unanticipated angles and used tactics that had not been predicted. The Fateless One's role in the assault was crucial, their presence creating zones of uncertainty that prevented the Tuatha from adapting their response as quickly as they normally would. Enemy commanders found their divination and foresight abilities failing them at critical moments, forcing them to rely on conventional tactical thinking that proved inadequate against the unprecedented nature of the attack. However, the battle was far from one-sided. The Tuatha forces were formidable opponents, even when surprised, and their supernatural weapons and abilities made them dangerous adversaries in direct combat. The fighting was fierce and desperate, with both sides throwing everything they had into what everyone understood was a decisive confrontation. General Tillera led the fortress breakout with characteristic courage and tactical brilliance, her forces fighting with the desperation of people who understood that this might be their only chance for freedom. The years of siege had hardened the defenders into elite troops, and their intimate knowledge of the local terrain gave them significant advantages in the close quarters fighting that developed around the fortress walls. The external resistance forces, coordinated by allies the Fateless One had gathered during their travels, struck at the Tuatha supply lines and communication networks with devastating effect. These attacks, while not decisive in themselves, created confusion and disruption that prevented the enemy from mounting an effective coordinated response to the main assault. As the battle raged, it became clear that the Tuatha were not simply facing a conventional military defeat, but were experiencing something unprecedented: the failure of fate itself to guarantee their victory. This realization spread through their ranks like a psychological plague, undermining the fanatical confidence that had made them such formidable opponents. The turning point came when the Fateless One and their companions succeeded in their mission to eliminate key Tuatha commanders and destroy the magical apparatus that was coordinating the siege. Without their supernatural command structure, the Tuatha forces found themselves unable to adapt to the rapidly changing tactical situation. The sight of their supposedly invincible enemies in retreat proved to be a powerful psychological boost for the mortal forces, who pressed their advantage with renewed vigor. For the first time since the Crystal War began, the Tuatha were not just being resisted, but were actually being defeated in open battle. However, victory came at a terrible cost. General Tillera, who had led the breakout with such courage and skill, fell in the final stages of the battle. Her death was not predetermined by fate, but was instead the result of a conscious choice to sacrifice herself to ensure the success of the mission. Her loss was devastating to the Alpha forces, but her sacrifice had meaning in a way that the predetermined deaths of the past had not. The breaking of the siege of Mel Sentia marked a crucial turning point in the Crystal War. For the first time, the mortal races had achieved a major victory against the Tuatha, proving that the enemy could be defeated despite their supernatural advantages. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that fate itself was no longer absolute, opening up possibilities for strategies and tactics that had previously been impossible. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. News of the successful defense spread throughout the Faelands, inspiring resistance movements and encouraging military leaders to develop more aggressive strategies against the Tuatha. The war was no longer a foregone conclusion, but had become a genuine contest with an uncertain outcome. The path to Alabastra. With the siege of Mel Sentia broken and the immediate threat to the Alfar homeland reduced, attention turned to the larger strategic question of how to end the war permanently. The victory at Mel Sentia had proven that the Tuatha could be defeated in battle, but it had not addressed the fundamental source of their power or their ultimate objectives. The intelligence gathered during the siege revealed that the Tuatha's activities were focused not on territorial conquest, but on a series of mystical rituals designed to weaken the barriers containing their goddess. The war itself was merely a means to an end, a way of generating the massive expenditure of magical energy needed to erode Tirnoch's prison. This realization forced a complete reassessment of the strategic situation. Simply defeating the Tuatha in battle would not be sufficient to end the threat. As long as Tirnoch remained imprisoned, but increasingly close to freedom. The only way to permanently end the war would be to either strengthen her prison or find a way to eliminate the goddess entirely. The search for solutions led the Fateless One and their allies to investigate the most ancient archives and consult with the oldest and wisest beings in the Faelands. These investigations revealed that Tirnoch's original imprisonment had been accomplished by a coalition of powers that no longer existed, using methods that had been deliberately forgotten to prevent anyone from undoing the work. However, the research also revealed that the prison's location in Alabastra, the capital of the Winterfell territory, now controlled by the Tuatha, might provide opportunities for either strengthening the containment or confronting Tirnoch directly. The city had been built around the prison site, its very foundations incorporating elements of the original containment system. The decision to mount an expedition to Alabastra was not made lightly. The city was now the heart of Tuatha power, heavily fortified and protected by their most elite forces. Any attempt to penetrate its defenses would require passing through territory where the enemy's supernatural advantages would be at their strongest. However, the alternative was to wait passively while Tirnoch's prison continued to weaken, eventually allowing her to escape and wreak havoc on the world. The Fateless One's unique abilities might provide the key to success where conventional approaches would certainly fail. The planning for the Alabastra expedition revealed the extent to which the Fateless One had become central to the war effort. Their ability to disrupt fate made them the only individual who could potentially penetrate the city's defenses undetected, while their power to change destiny offered the possibility of altering the predetermined outcome of any confrontation with Tirnoch. Preparing for the mission required gathering resources and allies from across the Faelands. The expedition would need not just military support, but also magical expertise, historical knowledge, and access to artifacts that might prove crucial in dealing with Tirnoch's power. The various factions that the Fateless One had worked with during the war all contributed their unique capabilities to the effort. The House of Ballads provided warriors trained in the kinds of heroic narratives that would be necessary for such an epic undertaking. The Scholia Arcana contributed magical knowledge and artifacts that might prove effective against an entity of Tirnoch's power. The Warsworn offered military expertise and tactical support for what was essentially a deep penetration mission into enemy territory. Perhaps most importantly, Alan Schur finally agreed to reveal more of the truth about the Fateless One's past and their original mission. The knowledge that they had once attempted to assassinate Gadflow and reseal Tirnoch provided crucial insights into the goddess's nature and weaknesses, as well as the methods that might prove effective against her. The revelation of their past also forced the Fateless One to confront questions about their own identity and purpose. Were they simply completing a mission that had been interrupted by death, or had their resurrection fundamentally changed who they were and what they were meant to accomplish? The answer to this question would ultimately determine not just their approach to the coming confrontation, but the very nature of their existence. Into the heart of darkness. The journey to Alabastra took the expedition through some of the most corrupted and dangerous territories in the Faelands. The Tuatha's influence had transformed the landscape itself, turning once beautiful forests into twisted parodies of nature, where the very trees seemed to writhe with malevolent intent. Ancient sites that had once been places of peace and contemplation had been converted into shrines to Tirnoch, their sacred energies perverted to serve the imprisoned goddess's dark purposes. The expedition faced constant harassment from Tuatha patrols and corrupted creatures that had been twisted by exposure to Tirnoch's influence. These encounters served as a grim preview of what they might expect when they reached the goddess's prison, as her power seemed to corrupt everything it touched, turning even innocent animals into aggressive predators driven by supernatural malice. The corruption was not merely physical, but also spiritual and mental. Members of the expedition reported strange dreams and visions, whispered voices promising power in exchange for service, and a growing sense of despair that seemed to seep into their very souls. Only the Fateless One seemed immune to these effects, their freedom from fate apparently extending to protection from Tirnoch's mental influence. As they drew closer to Alabastra, the effects of Tirnoch's proximity became more pronounced. The very air seemed thick with malevolent energy, and the landscape took on an increasingly surreal and nightmarish quality. Prismere crystals grew like tumors from the earth, pulsing with an inner light that seemed to mock the natural rhythms of day and night. The city of Alabastra itself was a monument to the corruption that had consumed the Winter Court. Once a place of austere beauty that reflected the Winter Fae's connection to the natural cycles of death and renewal, it had been transformed into a fortress of crystalline spires and twisted architecture that seemed to defy the laws of physics and aesthetics. The streets of the city were filled with Tuatha warriors and corrupted creatures, but there was something different about them compared to the enemies the expedition had faced in other locations. These beings seemed more focused, more purposeful, as if they were being directed by a single, overriding intelligence rather than simply following their own violent impulses. Infiltrating the city required all of the skills and knowledge that the expedition had accumulated during their long journey. The Fateless One's immunity to fate made them effectively invisible to the supernatural detection methods that would have exposed any other intruder, while their companions provided the tactical expertise and magical support needed to navigate the city's defenses. The architecture of Alabastra itself told the story of the Winter Court's fall and the Tuatha's rise. Ancient halls that had once hosted councils of wise Fae lords had been converted into barracks for fanatical warriors. Libraries that had contained millennia of accumulated wisdom had been burned, their contents replaced with propaganda glorifying Tirnoch and denouncing the mortal races. Most disturbing of all were the shrines that had been erected throughout the city, twisted amalgamations of Winter Fae tradition and Tuatha fanaticism that seemed designed to focus the city's spiritual energy toward the imprisoned goddess. These shrines pulsed with power that could be felt even by non-magical individuals, creating an atmosphere of oppressive malevolence that seemed to press down on the expedition like a physical weight. The journey through the city revealed the extent to which the Tuatha had abandoned the traditional ways of the Fae in favor of their new devotion to Tirnoch. Where the Winter Court had once embodied the necessary aspects of endings and renewal within the natural order, the Tuatha represented destruction for its own sake, death without the promise of rebirth. This transformation was most evident in the behavior of the Tuatha themselves. Where the Winter Fae had been stern but just, the Tuatha were cruel and capricious. Where the Winter Court had understood their role as part of a larger cosmic balance, the Tuatha sought only to serve their goddess's desire for revenge against the world that had imprisoned her. The expedition's progress through the city was aided by the intervention of surviving Winter Fae who had refused to join the Tuatha. These resistance fighters, led by individuals who remembered the old ways and rejected Gadflow's corruption, provided crucial intelligence and assistance that allowed the expedition to avoid the most heavily defended areas. The alliance with the Winter Fae resistance also provided important insights into the nature of the corruption that had consumed their court. It became clear that not all of the Tuatha had chosen their path willingly. Many had been coerced or magically influenced by Tirnoch's power, their natural personalities submerged beneath layers of supernatural compulsion. This revelation added a tragic dimension to the conflict, as it meant that many of the enemies they faced were themselves victims of Tirnoch's influence rather than willing servants. The knowledge that some of the Tuatha might be redeemed if Tirnoch's power could be broken provided additional motivation for the mission, though it also complicated the moral calculations involved in fighting their way through the city. The prison of Tirnoch, the heart of Alabastra, contained the entrance to the Amethyn, the mystical space between the physical world and the plane of magic, where Tirnoch had been imprisoned for tens of thousands of years. This entrance was heavily guarded by the most elite Tuatha forces, including Gadflow himself, who had taken personal responsibility for protecting the approach to his goddess. The Amethyn itself existed in a state of partial reality, neither fully in the physical world nor completely in the realm of pure magic known as Ashara. This liminal existence made it the perfect prison for a being of Tirnoch's power, as her abilities were constrained by the incomplete nature of her environment, while still preventing her from fully manifesting in either realm. However, the years of warfare and ritual sacrifice had begun to erode the barriers that maintained this delicate balance. The massive expenditure of magical energy involved in the Crystal War had fed power into Tirnoch's prison, gradually shifting its nature from a place of containment toward a launching point for escape. The physical manifestation of this change was visible in the form of massive prismere growths that had begun to appear throughout the Amethyn. These crystalline structures were not simply decorative. They were actually extensions of Tirnoch's power, physical anchors that allowed her to influence the material world despite her imprisonment. The expedition's approach to the Amethyn was detected by Gadflow, who had been waiting for this confrontation with an anticipation born of fanatical devotion. The Mad Jester understood that the arrival of the Fateless One represented the culmination of his goddess's plans, the final piece needed to complete her escape from the prison that had held her for so long. The confrontation with Gadflow was unlike any battle the expedition had previously fought. The corrupt Fey Lord wielded power that seemed to exceed normal limitations, his abilities enhanced by his connection to Tirnoch and his complete abandonment of the moral constraints that had once governed Fey behavior. Gadflow's attacks were not simply physical, but also psychological and spiritual, as he attempted to corrupt the expedition members through exposure to Tirnoch's influence. The battle became as much a contest of wills as a physical conflict, with the expedition's members struggling to maintain their sanity and moral identity, while facing an enemy who embodied the complete absence of such constraints. The Fateless One's immunity to fate proved crucial in this confrontation, as it extended to protection from many of the supernatural effects that Gadflow employed. While their companions struggled against visions, compulsions, and mental attacks, the Fateless One could focus on the physical aspects of the battle, using their unique abilities to disrupt Gadflow's tactics and create openings for their allies. However, even defeating Gadflow was not sufficient to prevent Tirnoch's escape. The Mad Jester had been merely a tool, and his destruction did not undo the damage he had already caused to the prison's integrity. The barriers containing Tirnoch continued to weaken, and her influence continued to grow stronger with each passing moment. It was at this crucial juncture that Alan Schur finally revealed the complete truth about the Fateless One's past and their original mission. The secret organization they had both served understood that Tirnoch's escape was not just a physical event, but also a narrative one. The goddess existed as much as a story as a physical being, and her freedom depended not just on breaking her prison, but on completing the tale of her revenge. The original mission had been designed not just to assassinate Gadflow, but to provide Tirnoch with the specific catalyst she needed to complete her escape. The Fateless One's death in the prison had been foreseen and planned for, serving as the final sacrifice needed to break the barriers that contained the goddess. However, the resurrection had changed the fundamental parameters of this narrative. Instead of providing Tirnoch with the power she needed, the Fateless One's return had introduced an element of genuine uncertainty into a story that had been carefully orchestrated for millennia. This revelation reframed the entire confrontation with Tirnoch from a battle between opposing forces to a contest between different narrative possibilities. The goddess represented the completion of an ancient story of revenge and destruction, while the Fateless One embodied the possibility of writing an entirely new ending. The Dragon Awakens. The final approach to Tirnoch's prison chamber revealed the full extent of the changes that had occurred during the years of the Crystal War. What had once been a place of austere containment had been transformed into something resembling a throne room, with massive prismere formations creating a crystalline cathedral around the central area where the goddess waited. Tirnoch herself was a sight that challenged the expedition's understanding of the possible. Neither fully dragon nor completely fey, she existed as something that transcended normal categories, her form shifting between different manifestations as her power fluctuated with her proximity to freedom. The ancient texts had described her as a dragon, but they had failed to convey the sheer presence and malevolent intelligence that radiated from her being. The goddess was not simply evil in the conventional sense, but represented something more fundamental: the rejection of the cosmic order that governed existence. Where the normal cycle of creation and destruction maintained the balance necessary for life to continue, Tirnoch embodied destruction without renewal, ending without the possibility of new beginning. Her conversation with the expedition revealed the depth of her manipulation and the extent of her planning. The entire Crystal War had been orchestrated to serve her purposes, with both sides unknowingly playing roles in a drama designed to weaken her prison and provide her with the power needed for escape. The Fateless One's original mission had been part of this plan, their death intended to provide the final catalyst for Tirnoch's freedom. Even their resurrection had been anticipated and incorporated into the goddess's schemes, as she believed that their unique nature would make them ideal instruments for completing her revenge against the world. However, Tirnoch had made one crucial miscalculation. In severing the Fateless One's connection to fate, the resurrection had also freed them from the predetermined role that the goddess had assigned to them. They were no longer bound by the narrative that Tirnoch had created, but could instead choose their own path and determine their own destiny. This realization marked the beginning of the final confrontation, not just between physical opponents, but between different concepts of what existence should be. Tirnoch represented the ancient story of inevitable revenge and destruction, while the Fateless One embodied the possibility of choice, change, and new beginnings. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had occurred in the history of Amalur. It was not simply a contest of physical power, but a conflict between different fundamental principles of reality. Every attack and counterattack carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate participants, affecting the very nature of fate and free will throughout the world. Tirnoch's power was immense, accumulated over millennia of imprisonment, and focused by years of careful planning. She wielded abilities that seemed to transcend normal magical categories, reshaping reality itself to serve her purposes. Her attacks were not just physical, but also temporal and conceptual, striking at the very ideas that defined her opponent's existence. However, the Fateless One's unique nature provided advantages that even Tirnoch had not fully anticipated. Their freedom from fate extended to immunity from many of the goddess's most devastating abilities, while their power to change destiny allowed them to alter the fundamental parameters of the confrontation. The turning point came when the Fateless One chose to fully embrace their nature as a being outside fate, using their abilities not just to resist Tirnoch's power, but to actively rewrite the story that contained them both. Instead of playing the role of victim or tool that the goddess had assigned, they chose to become the author of their own narrative. This act of narrative rebellion had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battle. By rejecting the predetermined story and choosing to create their own, the Fateless One fundamentally altered the nature of reality in Amalur. The rigid determinism of fate began to give way to genuine possibility, creating a world where choice and free will could exist alongside cosmic order. The defeat of Tirnoch was not accomplished through superior force, but through the assertion of a different principle of existence. The goddess's power was based on the inevitability of her revenge story. But when that story was rejected and replaced with something new, her foundation crumbled. With Tirnoch's defeat, the immediate threat to Amalur was ended. But the consequences of the confrontation would continue to resonate throughout the world. The breakdown of absolute fate meant that the future was no longer predetermined, creating both opportunities and challenges that no one could fully anticipate. The new age of uncertainty. The aftermath of Tirnoch's defeat brought profound changes to every aspect of life in Amalur. The most immediate and visible change was the end of the Crystal War, as the Tuatha forces suddenly found themselves without the supernatural compulsion that had driven their fanatical devotion to their cause. Many of the Tuatha, freed from Tirnoch's influence, reverted to their original Winterfey nature, though they struggled to understand their role in a world where the traditional cycles had been disrupted. Others, too, deeply corrupted by years of service to the goddess, remained hostile and dangerous. requiring ongoing military action to contain their threat. The prismere crystals that had given the Tuatha their supernatural weapons began to lose their power, crumbling into ordinary stone as the connection to Tirnoch's energy was severed. This development eliminated one of the Tuatha's major advantages, but also removed a valuable source of magical energy that many had hoped to harness for peaceful purposes. The most profound change, however, was the breakdown of absolute fate throughout the realm. Fate weavers across Amalur found their abilities becoming increasingly unreliable, their visions of the future replaced by uncertainty and possibility. This change was initially terrifying for people who had lived their entire lives with the certainty of predetermined destiny. Agarth's experience served as a model for how others might adapt to this new reality. His gradual acceptance of uncertainty and his development of new ways of understanding the world helped others learn to navigate an existence where choices genuinely mattered and the future was not fixed. The various factions that had supported the war effort found themselves needing to redefine their purposes in a world where the immediate threat had been eliminated. The Fatersworn transformed from a military organization into a peacekeeping force, helping to maintain order during the difficult transition period. The House of Ballads discovered that their eternal stories had been fundamentally changed by the introduction of genuine choice into their narratives. Where their tales had once followed predetermined patterns, they now contained real uncertainty and the possibility of multiple different endings. The Scholia Arcana found themselves with an unprecedented opportunity to study the nature of fate and free will, as the breakdown of predetermined destiny provided them with natural experiments that had never before been possible. The political implications of these changes were enormous. Rulers who had based their authority on the certainty of fated outcomes found themselves needing to justify their positions based on merit and popular support. Trade agreements and military alliances that had been considered permanent because they were fated to last suddenly became subject to renegotiation. The Fae courts faced perhaps the greatest challenges, as their entire existence had been based on playing predetermined roles in eternal stories. The Summer and Winter courts needed to develop new ways of understanding their purposes and relationships, while the various houses struggled to maintain their identities when their traditional narratives were no longer fixed. King Tatarian of the Summer Court emerged as one of the leaders in adapting to the new reality, working to develop new forms of Fae governance that could function in a world of genuine choice. His efforts to create flexible institutions that could adapt to changing circumstances served as models for other leaders facing similar challenges. The relationship between mortals and Fae also began to change, as the breakdown of predetermined fate created new possibilities for cooperation and mutual understanding. Projects that had been impossible under the old system of absolute destiny became feasible when both sides could make genuine choices about their future relationships. The Fateless One's legacy. As Amalur began to adapt to its new reality of uncertainty and choice, the Fateless One found themselves in a unique position as the catalyst who had made these changes possible. Their defeat of Tirnoch had not just ended the immediate threat, but had fundamentally altered the nature of existence for everyone in the realm. The knowledge that they had been responsible for such profound changes created both opportunities and burdens for the Fateless One. They were hailed as a hero by those who embraced the new freedom of choice, but they also faced criticism from those who mourned the loss of certainty that predetermined fate had provided. Some viewed the Fateless One as a liberator who had freed the world from the tyranny of inescapable destiny. Others saw them as a destroyer who had shattered the cosmic order that had maintained stability for millennia. The truth, as is often the case, was probably somewhere between these extremes. The Fateless One's unique nature continued to evolve as they adapted to their role in the post-Tirnoch world. Their immunity to fate remained, but they began to develop new abilities that reflected their growing understanding of their own nature and their relationship to the changed world around them. Their companions from the war also found their lives transformed by the experience. Agarth's adaptation to a world without predetermined fate made him a valuable advisor to others struggling with the same transition. His combination of warrior's pragmatism and former Fate Weaver's insight proved invaluable in helping people navigate the new reality. Alinshear's knowledge of the secret organization and its methods became important as the world struggled to address other hidden threats that had been overlooked during the crisis of the Crystal War. Her skills in diplomacy and espionage were crucial in managing the complex political transitions that followed Tirnoch's defeat. Fomerus Hugues's scientific approach to understanding the nature of souls and resurrection continued to advance, though his research was now focused on understanding the broader implications of the Fateless One's unique nature, rather than simply replicating the well of souls. The various regions of the Faelands each adapted to the new reality in their own ways. Dalantarth, which had been the site of the Fateless One's resurrection, became a center for studying the nature of choice and free will. Researchers and philosophers from across the realm came to study the site where fate had first been successfully challenged. The plains of Erathi, devastated by the initial Tuatha assault, slowly began to recover as the corrupting influence of Tirnoch's power was lifted. The Alfar worked to restore their homeland, while also developing new forms of governance that could function in a world where political outcomes were no longer predetermined. Daytire and its great city of Edessa became a hub for the intellectual revolution that followed the breakdown of absolute fate. The gnomes' libraries and research institutions attracted scholars who sought to understand the implications of the new reality and develop theoretical frameworks for navigating a world of genuine choice. Cluricon, which had been one of the primary battlegrounds of the Crystal War, slowly transformed from a devastated wasteland into a symbol of renewal and possibility. The region's recovery served as proof that even the most damaged areas could be restored when people were free to choose different paths forward. The broader world beyond the Faelands also began to feel the effects of the changes that had occurred. News of the breakdown of absolute fate spread to distant lands, inspiring movements for change and challenging established orders that had justified themselves through claims of inevitable destiny. The DLC adventures, expanding the legend. As the immediate crisis of the Crystal War passed, and Amalur began to adapt to its new reality, the Fateless One found themselves drawn into additional adventures that tested their abilities and explored different aspects of their unique nature. These experiences, while separate from the main conflict with Tirnoch, provided important insights into the broader implications of their existence and the ongoing challenges facing the world. The legend of Dead Kell represented one of the most unusual of these adventures, taking the Fateless One to the mysterious island of Gallows End. This isolated location had been cut off from the mainland for generations, developing its own unique culture and facing its own supernatural threats. The island was dominated by the infamous pirate captain Dead Kell, a figure who had achieved a form of twisted immortality through his connection to Akara, a godlike sentient tree that served as the island's spiritual center. Dead Kell's story paralleled the Fateless One's in some ways, as both had achieved a form of existence outside the normal rules of life and death. However, where the Fateless One had gained freedom from fate through their resurrection, Dead Kell had traded his humanity for power, becoming something more and less than human in the process. His immortality came at the cost of his connection to the natural cycles of growth and renewal, making him a creature of stagnation rather than change. The challenge of dealing with Dead Kell forced the Fateless One to confront questions about the nature of their own immortality and the responsibilities that came with their unique abilities. The pirate captain served as a cautionary example of what could happen when power was pursued without wisdom or moral constraint. The resolution of the Dead Kell crisis also provided the Fateless One with new responsibilities as they inherited control of Gallows End and its connection to Akara. This development added a new dimension to their role in the world, as they became not just a free agent, but also a ruler with subjects depending on their decisions. The Teeth of Naros. Adventure took the Fateless One to the land of the Colossi, the giant descendants of the ancient Titans who had built their civilization around devotion to the goddess Athene. This culture represented one of the most ambitious attempts to create a perfect society based on philosophical principles and divine guidance. However, the Colossi had fallen into despair following a tragic misuse of the Hyperion, a magical artifact that had been intended to enhance their connection to divine wisdom. The device's malfunction had caused tremendous destruction and had shattered their confidence in their ability to achieve the perfect society they had envisioned. The Fateless One's intervention in this crisis provided an opportunity to explore different approaches to governance and social organization. The Colossi had built their society around the belief that perfect wisdom could be achieved through proper philosophical understanding and divine guidance. But the failure of the Hyperion had called these fundamental assumptions into question. Working with the Colossi to address their crisis required the Fateless One to consider the broader implications of their own unique nature. Their freedom from fate had proven valuable in military conflicts and personal challenges, but how should it be applied to questions of social organization and collective governance? The solution that emerged involved helping the Colossi develop new forms of decision-making that incorporated uncertainty and choice, rather than relying solely on predetermined wisdom. This approach allowed them to maintain their philosophical orientation while adapting to a world where absolute certainty was no longer available. The experience also provided valuable insights into the challenges that other societies would face as the breakdown of absolute fate continued to spread beyond the Faelands. The Colossi's struggle to adapt their idealistic society to new realities served as a preview of the broader cultural transformations that would be necessary throughout Amalur. The Fatesworn expansion. New challenges emerge. Years passed after the defeat of Tirnoch and the resolution of the Crystal War, and the world of Amalur had begun to settle into its new reality of uncertainty and choice. The immediate crises had been resolved. The various factions had adapted to their changed circumstances, and people had learned to navigate life without the certainty of predetermined fate. However, this period of relative peace was not destined to last forever. New threats began to emerge from unexpected directions, challenges that tested whether the lessons learned during the Crystal War would be sufficient to handle different types of dangers. The first signs of trouble appeared in the form of strange reports from the mountainous region of Mithros, a previously peaceful area known primarily for its harsh climate and isolated communities. Travelers began reporting encounters with bizarre creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, entities that exhibited properties unlike anything that had been seen before. These creatures, which came to be known as chaos entities, appeared to be manifestations of pure disorder and unpredictability. Unlike the Tuatha, who had been driven by fanatical devotion to their goddess, these beings seemed to embody randomness itself, their actions following no discernible pattern or purpose. The emergence of chaos entities coincided with reports of rifts appearing in the fabric of reality itself. These dimensional tiers seemed to connect the material world to realms of pure chaos, allowing entities and energies from those realms to spill into Amalur. The rifts were unstable and unpredictable, appearing and disappearing without warning and depositing their chaotic cargo in random locations. Initial attempts to address this crisis using conventional methods proved ineffective. Military forces found that traditional tactics were useless against enemies whose behavior could not be predicted or countered through normal strategic thinking. Magical defenses designed to repel invasion or corruption were similarly ineffective against entities that seemed to exist according to entirely different rules. The discovery that these chaos entities were immune to many forms of magical compulsion and control suggested that they represented a fundamentally different type of threat than anything Amalur had previously faced. Where the Tuatha had been corrupted versions of familiar entities, the chaos creatures were something entirely alien to the world's normal systems of magic and natural law. Investigation into the source of these rifts revealed a disturbing connection to the changes that had occurred during the defeat of Tirnoch. The breakdown of absolute fate had created zones of uncertainty throughout the world, and these areas of weakened cosmic order had apparently become vulnerable to invasion from chaotic realms that existed beyond the normal boundaries of reality. This revelation suggested that the victory over Tirnoch, while necessary and beneficial in many ways, had also created new vulnerabilities that hostile forces could exploit. The freedom from predetermined fate that had liberated the people of Amalur had also opened doorways that some entities preferred to keep closed. The investigation into these developments eventually led to the discovery of a new threat. Telegrus, a mortal man who claimed to be the incarnation of the god of chaos itself. Unlike Gadflow's fanatical devotion to an external deity, Telegrus appeared to have internalized chaotic principles, becoming a living embodiment of disorder and unpredictability. Telegrus's agenda was fundamentally different from Tirnoch's desire for revenge and destruction. Where the dragon goddess had sought to impose her will on the world through domination and conquest, the self-proclaimed god of chaos wanted to free all beings from what he saw as the oppressive constraints of any form of order, including the new system of choice and free will that had emerged after Tirnoch's defeat. This philosophical opposition created a complex moral and strategic challenge for the Fateless One and their allies. Telegrus was not simply an enemy to be defeated, but represented a different vision of what existence should be. His arguments about the oppressive nature of all forms of order, even benevolent ones, forced a deeper examination of the assumptions underlying the post-Tirnoch world. The god of chaos had assembled a following of individuals known as the preordained, people who had chosen to embrace pure randomness and reject all forms of structure or predictability in their lives. These followers were not corrupted or coerced like the Tuatha had been, but were genuine converts who had voluntarily adopted chaotic principles. The preordained presented a different type of challenge than previous enemies, as their commitment to chaos made them nearly impossible to predict or counter through conventional means. Their actions followed no logical pattern, their strategies changed randomly, and their goals shifted without warning or explanation. Dealing with this threat required the Fateless One to develop new approaches that went beyond their previous experience with predetermined fate and cosmic order. The power to change destiny was less useful against enemies who had no fixed destiny to change, while the ability to introduce choice into rigid systems was irrelevant when facing opponents who had already embraced complete randomness. The return of old allies. The crisis created by Telegrus and his chaos entities necessitated reuniting with allies from the Crystal War, though the years had changed them all in significant ways. Agarth, who had adapted well to life without predetermined fate, found himself struggling with the implications of pure chaos, which represented a different kind of uncertainty than the freedom of choice he had learned to embrace. The former Fate Weaver's experience with the breakdown of fate had taught him to value the ability to make meaningful choices, but chaos threatened to eliminate the very possibility of meaningful action. In a truly random universe, decisions would have no lasting consequences, and effort would be pointless since outcomes would be determined by chance rather than intention. Agarth's philosophical struggle with these concepts reflected broader concerns about the implications of Telegrus's agenda. If the god of chaos succeeded in his goals, would the result be liberation or simply a different form of imprisonment? Was complete randomness truly preferable to the constraints of order, even voluntary order based on choice and consent? The reunion with old allies also revealed how the various factions and organizations that had supported the war effort had evolved during the years of peace. The Warsworn had transformed into an effective peacekeeping force, but their emphasis on order and justice put them in direct philosophical opposition to the chaotic forces now threatening Amalur. The House of Ballads had found new relevance in a world where their stories could have multiple possible endings, but they struggled to understand their role when faced with entities that rejected the very concept of narrative structure. How could they tell meaningful stories about beings whose actions followed no comprehensible pattern? The Scholia Arcana had made significant advances in understanding the nature of fate and free will, but their research methods were based on logical investigation and systematic study. The chaotic entities defied these approaches, exhibiting properties that seemed to change whenever they were observed or analyzed. Even the Fey courts, which had successfully adapted to the introduction of choice into their eternal stories, found themselves challenged by the prospect of pure randomness. The Summer and Winter courts had learned to embrace uncertainty within structured frameworks, but chaos threatened to eliminate the frameworks themselves. The challenge of confronting Telegrus required developing new forms of cooperation between these various groups, creating alliances that could function effectively against an enemy that defied conventional strategic thinking. This process tested whether the lessons learned during the Crystal War could be applied to fundamentally different types of threats. The investigation into Telegrus's activities revealed that he had been preparing for his campaign for years, carefully studying the changes that had occurred in Amalur since Tirnoch's defeat. His understanding of the weakened cosmic order was sophisticated and detailed, suggesting that he had access to information about the fundamental nature of reality that few others possessed. The god of chaos had also been experimenting with ways to harness and direct chaotic energies, creating weapons and artifacts that could channel pure randomness into focused effects. These chaos weapons were unpredictable in their operation, but devastatingly effective against conventional defenses that were designed to counter predictable threats. The discovery of procedurally generated chaos dungeons scattered throughout Amalur revealed the extent of Telegrus's preparations. These dimensional spaces existed partially outside normal reality, serving as training grounds for his followers and testing laboratories for his chaotic experiments. The dungeons also served as sources of chaos matter, a substance that could be harvested and forged into weapons and armor that functioned according to chaotic principles. This material allowed the creation of equipment that was immune to conventional enchantments and could adapt its properties randomly to counter whatever defensive measures were employed against it. The philosophy of chaos. The confrontation with Telegrus forced the Fateless One to engage with philosophical questions that went beyond the practical concerns of military victory or political stability. The god of chaos presented arguments about the nature of existence that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying the post-Tirnoch order. Telegrus argued that all forms of order, even those based on free choice, were ultimately oppressive because they limited the infinite possibilities of existence. According to his philosophy, true freedom could only be achieved through the complete elimination of structure, pattern, and predictability from the universe. This perspective forced a re-examination of the changes that had occurred since Tirnoch's defeat. Had the introduction of choice and free will truly liberated the people of Amalur, or had it simply replaced one form of constraint with another? Was the ability to make meaningful decisions actually more valuable than the complete freedom from consequence that pure chaos would provide? The god of chaos also questioned the value of identity and continuity, arguing that the concept of a persistent self was an illusion that prevented beings from experiencing the full range of possible existence. According to his philosophy, true enlightenment required abandoning the idea of a fixed personality or consistent goals in favor of embracing constant change and transformation. These arguments had particular relevance for the Fateless One, whose own identity had been shaped by the loss of memory and the radical change in personality that had accompanied their resurrection. If identity was indeed an illusion, then perhaps their struggle to understand their past and define their future was misguided effort that prevented them from achieving true freedom. The philosophical challenge posed by Telegrass was complicated by the fact that his arguments contained elements of truth alongside their more extreme conclusions. The recognition that all systems of order did indeed impose constraints was valid, even if the proposed solution of pure chaos was problematic. The debate over these issues extended beyond the immediate participants to involve scholars, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens throughout Amalur. The prospect of eliminating all forms of structure and predictability from existence forced people to articulate and defend their values in ways they had never been required to do before. Some individuals found Telegrass's arguments compelling, particularly those who had struggled to adapt to the new reality of choice and responsibility that had emerged after Tyrnok's defeat. For people who found the burden of making meaningful decisions overwhelming, the promise of complete freedom from consequence held obvious appeal. Others rejected the chaotic philosophy entirely, arguing that structure and order were necessary for any form of meaningful existence. Without predictable patterns and consistent rules, they argued, life would become meaningless suffering without the possibility of progress or achievement. A third group attempted to find middle ground between these positions, seeking ways to preserve the benefits of both order and freedom, while avoiding the extreme consequences of either total determinism or complete chaos. This approach required developing new philosophical frameworks that could accommodate both structure and flexibility. The Fateless One found themselves at the center of these debates, their unique nature making them a symbol for different sides of the argument. Supporters of order pointed to their ability to make meaningful choices as proof that freedom and structure could coexist, while advocates of chaos argued that their existence outside fate demonstrated the possibility of transcending all limitations. The final confrontation. The philosophical and practical challenges posed by Telegrass ultimately culminated in a direct confrontation that tested everything the Fateless One had learned about the nature of choice, fate, and freedom. Unlike the battle with Tyrnok, which had been fundamentally about rejecting a predetermined narrative, the conflict with the god of chaos involved defending the value of narrative itself. Telegrass had established his stronghold in a region where the barriers between realities had been almost completely eroded, creating a space where chaotic energies could flow freely, and normal physical laws had little meaning. This environment gave him significant advantages, but also created opportunities for unconventional tactics. The approach to this final battle required careful coordination between multiple groups with different capabilities and philosophies. The challenge was not just military, but also conceptual, as victory would require demonstrating the value of cooperative effort in the face of an enemy who argued that all forms of organization were meaningless. The battle itself took place across multiple levels of reality simultaneously, with combatants fighting not just for physical victory, but for the right to determine the fundamental nature of existence in Amalur. The outcome would determine whether the world would continue to develop along the path of structured freedom that had emerged after Tyrnok's defeat, or would descend into the pure randomness that Telegrass advocated. The Fateless One's role in this confrontation was unique, as their existence outside fate gave them the ability to function effectively in environments where normal cause and effect relationships had been disrupted. Their immunity to predetermined destiny extended to protection from the reality-altering effects of chaotic energies. However, victory required more than just resistance to chaos. It demanded the active assertion of alternative principles that could provide structure without oppression. The Fateless One had to demonstrate that meaningful choice was possible without falling into either extreme of absolute determinism or complete randomness. The resolution of this conflict involved not the destruction of chaos, but its integration into a larger system that included both order and disorder as necessary components. The goal was not to eliminate uncertainty, but to create frameworks within which uncertainty could exist without destroying the possibility of meaningful action. This solution required acknowledging the validity of Telegrass's critiques while rejecting his proposed solutions. The recognition that all forms of order did impose constraints led to the development of new approaches that maximized freedom while maintaining the minimum structure necessary for meaningful existence. The aftermath of this confrontation saw the establishment of new institutions and practices designed to balance the competing demands of freedom and order. These developments represented the maturation of the post-Tirnoch world into a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between choice and structure. The continuing journey. The resolution of the Chaos Crisis marked another turning point in the Fateless One's journey, but it was not an ending. The nature of their existence as someone outside fate meant that their story could not conclude in the traditional sense, as they remained free to write new chapters in their ongoing narrative. The experiences with both Tirnoch and Telegrus had demonstrated that the Fateless One's unique abilities were not just tools for solving immediate problems, but represented a fundamental challenge to traditional ways of understanding existence. Their very presence in the world continued to create new possibilities and opportunities that would not have existed otherwise. The world of Amalur had been transformed by these experiences, evolving from a place of rigid determinism through a period of structured freedom to arrive at a more complex understanding of the relationship between order and chaos. This evolution was ongoing, with new challenges and opportunities continuing to emerge as the implications of the changes worked their way through every aspect of society. The various allies and companions who had shared in these adventures found their own paths forward in the transformed world. Some continued to work with the Fateless One on new challenges, while others pursued independent projects that built on the lessons they had learned. All carried with them the understanding that meaningful choice was both possible and necessary. The factions and organizations that had played crucial roles in these conflicts continued to evolve and adapt to new circumstances. The House of Ballads developed new forms of storytelling that incorporated genuine uncertainty and multiple possible endings. The Scholia Arcana expanded their research into the nature of reality and consciousness. The Warsworn adapted their peacekeeping mission to address the ongoing challenges of a world in transition. The broader implications of these changes extended far beyond the immediate participants and locations. The breakdown of absolute fate and the integration of controlled chaos created ripple effects that would continue to influence the development of civilization throughout Amalur for generations to come. Reflections on choice and destiny. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through the complete story of Kingdoms of Amalur, Reckoning, it's worth reflecting on the deeper themes and meanings that emerge from this epic tale. At its heart, this is a story about the nature of choice and the relationship between freedom and responsibility in shaping our lives and our world. The Fateless One's journey from predetermined death through resurrection to ultimate freedom represents a universal human struggle with questions of agency and meaning. In our own lives, we often feel caught between the constraints of circumstance and the desire for genuine autonomy, seeking ways to make meaningful choices within the limitations we face. The world of Amalur, with its initial system of absolute fate, represents an extreme version of deterministic thinking that many people encounter in various forms, whether through social expectations, economic constraints, or personal limitations. We all face forces that seem to predetermine our futures and limit our options. The breakdown of fate and the introduction of genuine choice that follows the Fateless One's resurrection parallels the moments in our own lives when we realize that we have more agency than we previously understood. These revelations can be both liberating and terrifying as they force us to take responsibility for decisions that we might previously have attributed to external forces. The conflict with Tirnoch represents the struggle against forces that would impose their will through power and manipulation, using our own fears and limitations against us. The Dragon Goddess's attempts to control the Fateless One through predetermined narratives reflects the ways that oppressive systems often try to convince us that resistance is futile and that we have no choice but to accept our assigned roles. The later confrontation with Telagros explores the opposite extreme, examining the dangers of rejecting all forms of structure and constraint in the pursuit of absolute freedom. This cautionary tale reminds us that meaningful choice requires some framework within which to operate, and that complete randomness is not the same as genuine liberation. The resolution that emerges from these conflicts suggests a middle path that embraces both freedom and responsibility, choice and structure. The post-chaos world of Amalur represents an attempt to create systems that maximize individual agency while maintaining the social cooperation necessary for civilization to function. The ongoing nature of the Fateless One story reflects the reality that the struggle between freedom and constraint is never finally resolved, but requires constant attention and effort. Each new challenge presents fresh opportunities to exercise choice and define meaning, but also brings new temptations to surrender agency to external authorities or internal fears. The diverse cast of allies and companions who join the Fateless One on their journey represents the different aspects of ourselves that we must integrate in order to make wise decisions. Agarth's wisdom and experience, Alan's knowledge of hidden truths, Hughes's scientific curiosity, and Tylera's principled courage all contribute essential perspectives to the process of navigating complex moral and practical challenges. The various factions and organizations that play roles in the story represent different approaches to the challenge of creating meaningful community while preserving individual freedom. Each offers valuable insights while also demonstrating the limitations and dangers of taking any single approach to extremes. Perhaps most importantly, the story of the Fateless One reminds us that our choices matter, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. The ripple effects of individual decisions extend far beyond their immediate consequences, shaping the world in ways that create new possibilities or foreclose future options for others. The transformation of Amalur from a world of rigid fate to one of structured freedom demonstrates that positive change is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. However, it also shows that such change requires courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to accept responsibility for the consequences of our actions. The enduring legacy. And so concludes our deep dive into the complete story of Kingdoms of Amalur, Reckoning and its expansion, Fatesworn. We've journeyed through ancient ages of darkness and enlightenment, witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, and followed the extraordinary tale of the Fateless One who defied destiny itself to reshape the very nature of existence. From the mysterious depths of the Deep Gloam through the rise of the Erathi, from the corruption of the Winter Court to the emergence of the Tuatha Deohn, from the horrors of the Crystal War to the ultimate confrontation with cosmic forces of order and chaos, this epic saga has explored some of the most fundamental questions about the nature of free will, destiny, and the meaning of choice. The legacy of the Fateless One continues to resonate throughout Amalur, their actions having fundamentally altered the relationship between fate and freedom for every living being in the realm. The world they helped create represents both an achievement and an ongoing challenge, a place where meaningful choice is possible, but where the responsibility for those choices weighs heavily on all who inhabit it. The various allies, enemies, and factions we've encountered along the way each contributed their own perspectives to this grand narrative, creating a rich tapestry of competing philosophies and approaches to the fundamental questions of existence. From the noble Almain seeking divine order to the pragmatic Varani embracing change, from the proud Liao-Sal-Fa preserving tradition to the sophisticated Dokal-Fa manipulating from shadows, each group offered insights into different ways of understanding and navigating the complexities of life. The transformation of the Fey courts, the evolution of human settlements, the advancement of gnomish science, and the ongoing struggles between different visions of how society should be organized all reflect the broader themes of growth, adaptation, and the eternal tension between stability and change. Perhaps most significantly, The story demonstrates that even the most fundamental aspects of reality are not immutable if we have the courage to challenge them and the wisdom to create better alternatives. The breakdown of absolute fate and the emergence of genuine choice show that positive transformation is possible, even when facing cosmic forces that seem beyond any possibility of resistance. The ongoing nature of the Fateless One's journey reminds us that the work of creating and maintaining a free and just world is never finished. Each generation must grapple anew with the challenges of balancing individual liberty with collective responsibility, of preserving valuable traditions while adapting to changing circumstances, and of making meaningful choices in the face of uncertainty and complexity. The rich lore and complex world-building of Kingdoms of Amalur, reckoning created by the masterful R.A. Salvatore, provides not just entertainment, but genuine insight into the human condition and the eternal struggles that define our existence. The game's exploration of these themes through interactive storytelling allows players to not just observe these philosophical debates, but to participate in them, making choices that shape both the narrative and their understanding of the underlying issues. As we've seen throughout this journey, the power of story itself plays a crucial role in shaping reality, both within the world of Amalur and in our own lives. The narratives we tell ourselves about who we are, what's possible, and what our choices mean have profound effects on the outcomes we achieve and the world we create. The Fateless One's ultimate victory lies not just in defeating powerful enemies, but in demonstrating that better stories are possible, that we can reject the narratives that constrain us and write new ones that open up possibilities for growth, freedom, and meaningful connection with others. Thank you for joining me on this epic journey through one of gaming's most thoughtful and sophisticated explorations of choice, destiny, and the meaning of freedom. The story of the Fateless One and the world of Amalur continues to offer valuable insights for anyone struggling with questions of agency, responsibility, and the challenge of creating meaning in an uncertain world. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the lore and themes of Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to Lore 2 RPG for more comprehensive explorations of gaming's greatest stories. Until next time, keep exploring those epic tales, fellow adventurers, and remember that in your own life, as in the world of Amalur, your choices matter and your story is still being written.